It began with movement, the kind of movement that didn't feel human, didn't feel possible, didn't feel like something born from mud, fuel, and muscle. When Patton's Third Army arrived in Europe, the war felt stuck, as if the entire continent had jammed itself into a gear too heavy to shift, roads clogged with wreckage, bridges blown apart, supply lines bleeding, armies exhausted. But then the Third Army rolled in, and everything that had been frozen for months started to tremble. Patton didn't command them like a general, he unleashed them like a force. The Third Army didn't march. It surged. It devoured distance the way storms devour horizon. Villages that had expected days or weeks of fighting watched columns of American armor rumble through their streets in hours. Cities that had braced for siege found themselves liberated before the defenders understood what direction the attack was coming from. The Third Army moved with a speed that felt unreal. Maps became outdated the moment they were folded. Orders were rewritten before they could be delivered. Soldiers joked that even their shadows had trouble keeping up. But behind the speed was exhaustion, a kind that deepened with every mile. Men slept in half-broken tanks that shook from the engine heat. They ate cold rations sitting in ditches carved by artillery. They cleaned their rifles with hands still trembling from battle. They joked about Patton's demands, but they obeyed them, because somehow they knew the speed was saving lives, theirs. Civilians, prisoners, all of them. Momentum was oxygen. Slowing down meant suffocating. Across France, the Third Army bent the war in directions no one had predicted. They crossed rivers at night, fought through hedgerows at dawn, liberated towns by noon, and pushed deeper before the sun had time to set. They sliced through German lines like a blade that refused to dull. And whenever the enemy tried to regroup, the Third Army was already behind them, already breaking their supply lines, already unraveling the threads holding their defenses together. Then came the winter, the great freezing pause that tried to stop everything. Fuel shortages, snowstorms, ice thick enough to swallow trucks, roads turned into glass, engines seized, guns jammed, breath froze before it left a man's lips, and still Patton pushed them forward. When the Ardennes erupted and Bastogne cried for help, Patton's Third Army turned south with a speed that stunned even the high command. They carved through snow, through ice, through miles of misery. They moved so fast that meteorologists joked the weather couldn't keep up. And when they reached Bastogne, the circle broke not because of magic, but because of determination wrapped in steel. After that, the Third Army didn't slow. It couldn't. There was still too much war left to end. Across the Saar, across the Rhine, across Germany itself, the Third Army hammered its way forward, city after city, river after river, line after line. They liberated camps whose stories would haunt the world forever. They opened roads that had been closed by fear and brutality. They pushed until there was nowhere left to push, until the last resistance cracked, until the war that had consumed the world finally began to loosen its grip. Tonight, we return to the movement that changed everything, to the engines growling before dawn, to the tracks grinding through mud and snow, to the soldiers who learned that speed could be as deadly as any weapon and twice as necessary, to the army that became legend not because it was perfect, but because it refused to stop. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something different tonight, something personal and in your own words. When you think about momentum in your own life, is there a moment when you finally began moving again after feeling stuck? It doesn't have to be dramatic. Just a moment you remember. If you want, you can share it. And one more invitation, unique to this documentary. As you listen tonight, think about a place in your life where you want to move forward even slowly. And if you feel comfortable, tell me what your next small step might be. Not the whole journey, just the next inch. And if these long, quiet walks through history help you relax, settle your thoughts, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. January 26, 1944, Dover, England. A German reconnaissance plane circles at 20,000 feet, its camera clicking methodically as the pilot banks over the white cliffs. Below, spread across the fields of Kent, lies what appears to be the greatest concentration of Allied military power in Britain. Hundreds of tanks gleam in neat rows, truck convoys stretch for miles, entire infantry divisions practice amphibious assaults on nearby beaches. The pilot's report will land on Hitler's desk within 48 hours, confirming Germany's greatest fear, General George S. Patton, America's most dangerous commander, is preparing to invade France at the Pas de Calais with over 1 million men. But every tank the pilot photographs is inflatable rubber. Every truck is plywood and canvas. Every radio transmission is fiction. The largest and most aggressive American army in Europe doesn't exist, and the man commanding this phantom force is forbidden from fighting the war that made him famous. The deception began 3 months earlier, born from disgrace and genius in equal measure. In August 1943, Lieutenant General George Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in Sicilian field hospitals, calling them cowards while their comrades watched in horror. The incidents, leaked to American reporters, nearly ended his career. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, needed Patton's tactical brilliance, but couldn't afford the political cost of his temper. The solution was brilliant in its cruelty. Exile Patton to command a ghost army. On January 26, 1944, Patton officially took command of the 1st United States Army Group, known by its acronym FUSAG. The command included the 3rd Army, which existed on paper but had no soldiers, no tanks, and no mission except to deceive. For Patton, a warrior who measured self-worth in conquered miles and enemy casualties, the assignment was a special kind of torture. He would spend the most critical months of the war as an actor in the greatest bluff in military history. Operation Fortitude South transformed southeast England into a theatre of illusion. British deception specialists, working with American engineers, created 11 fictitious divisions using materials that wouldn't fool a close inspection but looked perfect from 20,000 feet. Dummy Sherman tanks, constructed from inflatable rubber stretched over frames, sat in fields where German reconnaissance planes would photograph them, plywood trucks, painted with meticulous detail, lined roads that led nowhere, canvas landing craft bobbed in harbours, their hollow shells requiring only a handful of men to position and maintain. But the real genius wasn't the props, it was the performance. Patton's headquarters generated hundreds of fake radio transmissions daily, creating the electronic signature of a massive military organisation. Double agents, carefully managed by British intelligence, fed German spies information about FUSAG's fictional order of battle. When Patton travelled, he did so conspicuously, allowing German agents to track his movements and conclude that wherever Patton went, the main invasion would follow. The deception worked because it exploited Hitler's psychology and German military doctrine with surgical precision. Hitler believed, correctly, that Patton was America's finest field commander. German intelligence had studied his North African and Sicilian campaigns, documenting his aggressive tactics and operational brilliance. To German strategic thinking, it was inconceivable that the Allies would launch their primary invasion without their best general leading the assault. When German reconnaissance confirmed Patton commanding forces opposite Calais, the shortest route to Germany across the English Channel, it validated every assumption Hitler held about Allied strategy. Throughout spring 1944, as the real invasion force assembled in southern England under different commanders, Hitler kept his most powerful mobile divisions frozen at Pas de Calais, waiting for Patton. 15 German divisions, including elite panzer units that could have devastated the Normandy landings, sat idle because a temperamental American general commanded an army of rubber and plywood. Behind the deception, the real Third Army prepared for war in secret. Throughout April and May 1944, over 250,000 American soldiers arrived in Britain, shuttled to camps in the southwest where German reconnaissance rarely penetrated. These men knew they were joining Third Army, but secrecy protocols prevented them from discussing their assignment even among themselves. Officers studied maps of French terrain without knowing when or where they would fight. Tank crews trained in maintenance and maneuver without being told their objectives. Supply officers stockpiled ammunition, fuel, and rations according to plans they weren't authorized to read in full. The entire organization existed in a strange limbo, simultaneously real and phantom, training for an invasion, while officially serving as props in Patton's theatrical command. For the soldiers, the uncertainty was maddening. For their commander, pacing his Dover headquarters while watching other generals lead the attack he believed should be his, it was agony. June 6, 1944, D-Day. While American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Patton remained at his FUSAG headquarters, forbidden from participating in the greatest amphibious assault in history. He spent the day monitoring radio reports, watching other commanders earn glory while he commanded an army that existed only in German imagination. But even as Allied forces fought desperately to expand their tiny beachhead, Operation Fortitude South continued its work. German intelligence, monitoring Allied radio traffic, detected Fusag's increased signal activity, interpreting it as preparation for the real invasion at Calais. Hitler, convinced Normandy was a diversion, refused to release the panzer divisions guarding Pas-de-Calais. For 7 critical weeks, while Allied forces struggled to break out of Normandy's hedgerow country, 15 German divisions sat idle, 150 miles away, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Patton's Phantom Army had achieved what real armies couldn't. It had paralyzed German strategic reserves during the most critical phase of the invasion. The deception held even as evidence mounted that Normandy was the primary assault. German commanders in France, watching Allied forces pour into the beachhead, begged Hitler to release the Calais divisions for counterattack. Hitler refused, citing intelligence reports that showed Patton still commanding Fusag across from Pas-de-Calais. On July 6th, a full month after D-Day, German High Command still estimated that Patton commanded 45 divisions preparing to assault Calais. The actual number of divisions under Patton's command was 0. British double agents continued feeding information to German intelligence, creating fictional preparation timelines for Fusag's assault. German reconnaissance planes continued photographing dummy equipment, interpreting increased activity as invasion staging. The Allies had achieved something unprecedented in warfare. They had convinced an enemy to ignore reality and believe a fiction, even as reality was killing them. July 28, 1944. Patton received the call that would transform him from actor to warrior. In a secret meeting at Omar Bradley's headquarters, now established in Normandy, Eisenhower delivered news that made months of humiliation worthwhile. Third Army would activate on August 1st, and Patton would finally enter the war. But he wouldn't be leading the invasion at Calais, because there would be no invasion at Calais. Fusag would continue as a deception, now commanded by other officers, while Patton took his real army, his 250,000 soldiers, who had been training in secret, and drove them into the heart of France. The mission was the most ambitious assignment given to any American commander: break through German lines at Avranches, then exploit the breakthrough with maximum speed and aggression. Patton left the meeting transformed. For 4 months, he had been a prop in someone else's operation. In 72 hours, he would command the spearhead of Allied victory. The activation of Third Army on August 1st occurred with deliberate ambiguity designed to maintain the deception as long as possible. Allied press releases mentioned Patton assuming a field command but provided no details about unit designation or location. Radio traffic from Fusag continued, now generated by skeleton crews, suggesting the Ghost Army remained operational. German intelligence, desperate to locate Patton, eventually identified him in Normandy but couldn't determine whether he commanded a small task force or a major army. This confusion persisted for 2 critical weeks, during which Third Army would exploit the breakout with such speed that German commanders couldn't track its movements or strength. When German High Command finally understood that Patton commanded a massive operational force in Normandy, not Calais, they also realized they had been deceived on a scale unprecedented in military history. The Phantom Army had ceased to exist, but only because the real army had become something far more dangerous. The legacy of Operation Fortitude South and Patton's role in it reveals a profound irony about the nature of command and contribution. Patton, a general who defined himself through aggressive action, had contributed more to Allied victory through patient deception than through any of his earlier battles. The 15 divisions frozen at Calais during the critical weeks after D-Day represented roughly 120,000 German soldiers and hundreds of tanks that could have slaughtered Allied forces on the beaches or crushed the breakout attempts in July. By keeping those forces paralyzed through the power of his reputation alone, Patton had saved thousands of Allied lives before firing a shot, but this contribution, bloodless and invisible, brought him no satisfaction. When Third Army activated and he finally led soldiers into combat again, Patton drove them with fury that seemed to make up for lost time, as if months of forced inaction demanded compensation through maximum aggression. The Phantom Army had served its purpose and vanished. The real army that emerged would move so fast that within weeks, German commanders would wish Patton had remained a fiction. April 15th, 1944. A nondescript building in Bristol, England. Staff officers of 12th Corps hunched over maps of French terrain. their fingers tracing roads that most had never seen except in reconnaissance photographs. Major General Manton Eddy, the Corps commander, stood at the head of the table asking a question that would define Third Army's approach to warfare. How did the Germans move so fast in 1940? The officers, studying captured German documents and after-action reports from the fall of France, were reverse engineering blitzkrieg. They examined the ratio of tanks to trucks in German panzer divisions. They analysed fuel consumption rates during sustained advances. They calculated the speed at which infantry could follow armoured breakthroughs without creating dangerous gaps. Eddy wanted his corps to be the American version of a Panzer Corps, fast enough to exploit breakthroughs but balanced enough to sustain operations. What these officers were designing in a Bristol conference room would become the organisational template for the most mobile American army in the European theatre. The structure of Third Army, as it took shape through spring 1944, reflected Patton's obsession with mobility and his willingness to challenge conventional American military doctrine. Standard American practice, organised infantry and armoured divisions separately, assigning them different missions and maintaining distinct command structures. Patton demanded something different: mechanised combined arms teams where infantry and armour trained together, fought together, and thought of themselves as a single entity. His organisational model grouped 2 armoured divisions and 1 mechanised infantry division within each corps, creating balanced forces capable of both breakthrough and exploitation. Third Army would initially field 4 corps, 8th, 12th, 15th, and 20th, with 12 divisions total. But the organisation was designed for expansion. Supply lines, communication networks, and staff structures could accommodate additional corps and divisions without reorganisation. By the war's end, Third Army would grow to 6 corps and 42 divisions, over 500,000 men, without changing its fundamental structure. The vehicle composition of Third Army revealed Patton's understanding that modern warfare was as much about logistics as combat. Each infantry division in Third Army received 2,300 vehicles, substantially more than standard army allocations. Each armoured division operated over 3,600 vehicles, creating columns that could stretch for miles when moving on roads. But the real innovation was in the Army's organic truck fleet. Third Army fielded over 15,000 trucks dedicated to supply transport, enough to move thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations hundreds of miles in a single day. This represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. Traditional armies relied on railroads to move supplies forward, then used trucks for short final delivery to units. Patton's Third Army could bypass railroads entirely, creating supply lines that moved as fast as his tanks. The trucks weren't glamorous, and Patton's press coverage always focused on tanks and combat units, but the 6x6 cargo trucks were the real secret to Third Army's operational range. Tank composition reflected lessons learned from fighting Germans in North Africa and Sicily. Third Army fielded over 2,500 tanks at full strength, primarily the M4 Sherman in various configurations, but Patton had pushed for modifications that increased sustainability during extended operations. Every tank battalion in Third Army included dedicated maintenance platoons with recovery vehicles and mobile repair shops. Tank crews trained not just in gunnery and manoeuvre, but in field maintenance, learning to replace tracks, repair engines, and fix transmissions without waiting for rear echelon mechanics. Patton's philosophy, expressed in dozens of memos to his commanders, was fix it forward, never retreat for repairs. A tank that threw a track should be repaired where it stopped, not towed to a distant depot. A tank with engine trouble should be repaired by its crew, not specialists. This approach kept more tanks operational and created a culture where mechanical problems were tactical challenges to overcome, not excuses to withdraw from combat. Artillery organisation demonstrated Third Army's commitment to mobile firepower. The Army operated over 1,800 artillery pieces, from 75mm pack howitzers to 240mm heavy guns, organised in battalions that could displace and fire with remarkable speed. But numbers alone didn't distinguish Third Army's artillery from other armies. The innovation was in coordination and communication. Patton established a centralised fire direction system that allowed any unit in contact with the enemy to request fire support from any artillery battalion in range, not just units assigned to their division or corps. This required sophisticated radio networks and trained forward observers, but it meant Third Army could mass artillery fire with devastating speed. A company of infantry encountering resistance could have 12 battalions of artillery, 144 guns, firing in support within minutes. German units, accustomed to fighting American forces that used artillery cautiously and slowly, would learn to fear the sudden, overwhelming concentrations that Third Army could generate. Communication networks received investment that other commands considered excessive but that Patton deemed essential. Third Army operated over 15,000 radio sets, from portable infantry radios to powerful truck-mounted command sets. Every tank platoon could reach its company headquarters by radio, every company could reach battalion, every battalion could reach corps. Most revolutionary, every division could reach army headquarters directly, bypassing intermediate commands. This violated traditional military doctrine, which insisted on rigid chains of command and sequential reporting. Patton didn't care about tradition. He wanted to know what was happening at the front immediately, not filtered through layers of staff officers. The radio network meant that a tank company commander encountering unexpected German resistance could speak directly to army intelligence within minutes, providing real-time updates that shaped operational planning. It also meant Patton could intervene in tactical situations when he judged subordinates were being too cautious, a practice that his corps commanders both appreciated for its decisiveness and resented for its micromanagement. The human element of Third Army's organization reflected Patton's belief that training determined performance more than equipment or doctrine. Throughout spring and early summer 1944, while officially commanding the Phantom Fusag, Patton personally supervised Third Army's real training regimen with obsessive attention to detail. Units practiced river crossings until they could build pontoon bridges and get entire divisions across in hours, not days. Infantry drilled in night operations until they could maneuver in darkness with minimal light discipline. Tank infantry teams rehearsed coordinated attacks until the movements became instinctive. Patton attended field exercises unannounced, watching maneuvers from observation posts and then gathering officers for brutal critiques. He fired battalion commanders who failed to meet his standards and promoted aggressive lieutenants over cautious majors. By July 1944, when Third Army prepared to enter combat, its officers and soldiers had trained together for months, understood their equipment intimately, and shared a common tactical language that enabled rapid decision-making under pressure. Supply doctrine represented perhaps Patton's most radical departure from conventional American military practice. Standard Army procedure established supply depots in the rear and moved materials forward through a chain of distribution points, each requiring stockpiling and administrative processing. This created security and accountability, but sacrificed speed. Patton's system eliminated intermediate steps wherever possible. Supply trucks loaded at ports or major depots drove directly to frontline units, sometimes travelling 200 miles or more without stopping at intermediate points. This required trusting junior officers with enormous responsibility, quartermaster lieutenants making decisions about resource allocation that would normally require approval from majors or colonels. It also required accepting higher loss rates from accidents, pilferage, and enemy action. Patton considered these costs acceptable because the system delivered supplies where they were needed when they were needed, giving Third Army operational flexibility that more cautious logistics couldn't match. Personnel policies revealed Patton's contradictory character, simultaneously progressive and medieval in his approach to command. Third Army was among the first major American commands to integrate black soldiers into combat units in significant numbers, assigning black tank battalions and artillery battalions to fight alongside white units. Patton, who had expressed racist views in private correspondence, nevertheless recognized that he needed every capable soldier to maintain his operational tempo and promoted based on performance regardless of race. At the same time, he insisted on discipline that seemed archaic to soldiers accustomed to more relaxed American commands. Patton required proper uniforms, military courtesy, and attention to appearance even in combat zones. Soldiers who appeared slovenly received immediate correction. Officers who failed to enforce standards lost commands. Patton believed that discipline in small things, saluting, shined boots, properly maintained equipment, translated into discipline in combat, where small failures could cause catastrophic consequences. The final element of Third Army's anatomy was the command philosophy Patton drilled into every officer in his organization. On July 31st, 1944, hours before Third Army officially activated, Patton gathered his division commanders for a final briefing. Standing before maps of France, he delivered the tactical principles that would guide their operations. There is only one tactical principle which is not subject to change. It is to use the means at hand to inflict the maximum amount of wounds, death, and destruction on the enemy in the minimum time. The faster you can fight, the more casualties you will inflict on the enemy, the fewer casualties you will suffer. Therefore, attack rapidly, ruthlessly, viciously, and without rest. These weren't empty words. They were the operational code that would govern Third Army through 300 kilometers of France in 30 days, through the snow of Bastogne, through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany. The army that existed in Bristol conference rooms and training grounds was about to become the warhammer that would smash across Europe. August 1st, 1944, 1200 hours, a small stone church near Avranches, France. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood in the doorway as a military policeman changed the sign on the building from 1st Army Forward Command Post to 3rd Army Headquarters. The change required exactly 30 seconds. It marked the transfer of operational control over 4 American divisions, from Omar Bradley's 1st Army to Patton's newly activated 3rd Army. Patton watched without ceremony, then walked to a map table where his staff had marked the current front lines with red pencil. The red line showed a thin corridor, barely 5 miles wide, punched through German defences by 7 days of brutal 1st Army fighting. Behind that corridor, 4 intact American divisions waited for orders. Patton studied the map for perhaps 10 seconds, then issued the command that would transform the Normandy campaign: take Avranches, get across the bridges, don't stop for anything. 24 hours later, his lead divisions would penetrate 15 miles into the German rear. 72 hours later, they would cover 60 miles. The breakout had begun. The strategic situation that Patton inherited was the product of 2 months of attritional warfare that had ground up divisions on both sides. Since D-Day, Allied forces had been trapped in Normandy's bocage country, a landscape of small fields separated by ancient earthen walls and thick hedgerows that made every farm a fortress. American infantry had fought yard by yard through terrain that favoured defenders so completely that casualties approached World War I levels. German forces, reinforced and resupplied despite Allied air superiority, had contained the invasion within a lodgement roughly 60 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Both sides had bled themselves nearly white in 2 months of continuous combat. Then, on July 25th, 1st Army launched Operation Cobra, a breakthrough attempt supported by the largest aerial bombardment yet delivered in close support of ground troops. 2,500 heavy bombers carpeted a 5-mile section of German lines with over 4,200 tons of explosives. The bombardment killed thousands of German soldiers, destroyed equipment, and shattered the defensive line. 1st Army infantry poured through the gap, reaching Avranches by July 31st and capturing the bridges over the Saloon and Sea rivers intact. Patton's operational plan for exploiting this breakthrough was breathtakingly simple in concept and terrifyingly risky in execution. Instead of broadening the Avranches corridor to create a secure supply route before advancing, he would send his armoured divisions racing south and east immediately, accepting the risk of operating through a bottleneck where German counterattack could cut his entire army's supply line. 8th Corps, commanded by Major General Troy Middleton, would drive south into Brittany to capture the ports of Brest, St. Malo, and Lorient, securing harbours for future supply operations. The other 3 Corps, 12th, 15th, and 20th, would wheel east, driving deep into France before German forces could establish new defensive lines. Speed was everything. Patton calculated correctly that German forces were too disorganized from Cobra's devastation to mount coordinated counterattacks for several days. If 3rd Army moved fast enough, they could be 30 or 40 miles deep before Germans could react. If they hesitated, the window would close. The execution began at 14:30 hours on August 1st, when Combat Command B of 4th Armoured Division, led by Brigadier General Holmes Dager, received orders to attack through Avranches toward Pont-à-Bol. Dager's combat command consisted of roughly 4,000 men in tanks, armoured infantry, and self-propelled artillery, organised into balanced teams capable of independent action. They hit the road south in a column that stretched for miles, tanks and half-tracks roaring through French villages, where civilians emerged from cellars to discover their German occupiers had vanished. German resistance was sporadic and disorganized. Isolated outposts fired at American columns, then fled or surrendered when the Americans returned fire and kept moving. By sunset, Combat Command B had advanced 15 miles and secured the critical bridges at Pontebol intact and barely defended. Behind them, the rest of 4th Armored Division followed, and behind the tanks came 6th Armored Division, 90th Infantry Division, and 79th Infantry Division, an entire corps pouring through the Avranches corridor. The Avranches bottleneck, which Allied planners had feared would slow the advance, instead became a showcase of Third Army's organisational efficiency. The gap through which 4 entire divisions had to pass was, at its narrowest point, approximately 100 yards wide, a space where a single German artillery strike could cause catastrophic traffic jams. Patton assigned his most experienced staff officers to traffic control, positioning military police at every intersection with authority to override unit commanders if necessary to keep traffic moving. Vehicles moved in prescribed order. Tanks first, then infantry and half-tracks, then supply trucks, then artillery. Units that broke down were pushed off the road immediately. No time for repairs in the corridor. Medical evacuation moved backward through gaps between advancing units. The system worked because everyone, from Patton to the military police directing traffic, understood that speed mattered more than perfect order. By August 4th, over 30,000 vehicles had passed through Avranches, an average of 1 vehicle every 4 seconds for 72 continuous hours. 4th Armoured Division, spearheading Patton's exploitation, demonstrated the operational concept that 3rd Army would employ for the next 11 months. The division didn't attack as a unified mass, but as multiple combat commands operating semi-independently along parallel routes, advancing on different roads toward complementary objectives. Combat Command A drove southeast toward Rennes. Combat Command B pushed east toward Chateau Gontier. The Division Reserve followed the most successful command, ready to exploit breakthroughs. When German forces tried to establish blocking positions, they discovered American tanks already in their rear, forcing hasty retreats. When Germans tried to retreat, they ran into American roadblocks. Major General John Wood, 4th Armoured's commander, operated on radio communication with Patton's headquarters, receiving mission-type orders that specified objectives but not methods. Get to Rennes by August 3rd was a typical order. How Wood got there was his decision, a level of operational freedom that American doctrine discouraged but that Patton insisted upon. The human experience of Third Army's breakout was simultaneously exhilarating and exhausting for the soldiers executing it. Tank crews operated for 72 hours or more with minimal sleep, catching brief naps when their units stopped for refueling. Infantry soldiers rode in cramped half-tracks or on the back decks of tanks, scanning for German ambushes while trying not to fall off when vehicles hit potholes or took sharp turns. French civilians emerged from villages with flowers, wine, and intelligence about German positions, their joy at liberation mixed with shock at the speed of American operations. Germans, when encountered, often seemed as surprised as the French. American tankers reported finding German soldiers eating meals, maintaining equipment, or sleeping in buildings, unaware that American forces had penetrated so deep so fast. Prisoners, when interrogated, consistently expressed disbelief about the distance and speed of Third Army's advance, convinced they must have been captured by reconnaissance units, not main combat forces. By August 4th, 72 hours after Third Army activated, Patton's forces had created a situation that German commanders considered impossible. 4th Armoured Division held Rennes, 60 miles from Avranches. 6th Armoured Division approached Dinant, 50 miles from Avranches. 90th Infantry Division controlled the roads south of Avranches, protecting the corridor. 79th Infantry Division pushed toward Figueres. The German defence line hadn't been pushed back. It had simply ceased to exist across a front of 40 miles and a depth of 60 miles. German 7th Army, which had contained Allied forces for 2 months, was disintegrating. German commanders submitted situation reports to their superiors that read like fiction. Enemy armoured forces reported in all sectors. Current defensive line unknown. Unit locations uncertain. Request permission to withdraw to prevent encirclement. Patton, reading intercepted German communications at his headquarters, recognized that his enemy was broken psychologically as well as organizationally. The time for caution had passed. The first week of August established patterns that would characterize Third Army operations for the duration of the war in Europe. Aggressive junior officers received promotions and increased responsibility. Cautious commanders received relief and transfer to rear echelon positions. Supply officers learned to improvise, stealing from other units when necessary, commandeering civilian trucks when military vehicles were insufficient, running convoys 24 hours without rest when operations demanded it. Intelligence officers learned to trust frontline reports over doctrine, accepting that when tank commanders reported no German resistance for 40 miles, it probably meant German resistance had collapsed, not that German forces were hiding. And Patton's headquarters staff learned to process information and issue orders at a pace that would have overwhelmed more methodical commands. In the first week, Third Army advanced further than First Army had in 2 months, captured more prisoners, liberated more French territory, and suffered fewer casualties. The Warhammer had struck its first blow. The Germans were reeling, and Patton had no intention of giving them time to recover. August 7th, 1944, Le Mans, France. A French resistance fighter named Henri Durand crouched in a bakery cellar, listening to the rumble of engines approaching from the west. For 4 years, Durand had survived German occupation through caution and deception, never acting without planning escape routes, never trusting information without verification. Now, American tanks were reportedly approaching his city 150 miles from where they'd broken through German lines 6 days earlier. Durand didn't believe it. The speed was impossible. German radio claimed the American breakthrough was contained. Vichy collaborators assured citizens that reinforcements would crush the American spearhead within days. Then, at dawn, Durand heard the distinctive roar of American Sherman tanks and climbed to street level to witness what German authorities had insisted couldn't happen. 15th Corps, commanded by Major General Wade Hayslip, rolled through Le Mans in columns that stretched to the horizon, tank crews waving at civilians who emerged from hiding with French flags they'd concealed for years. The Germans hadn't retreated from Le Mans. They had simply vanished during the night, fleeing east before the American advance. Durand watched American soldiers eating breakfast from ration cans while their tanks idled in the town square, and realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, an entire army moving faster than information itself. The strategic concept behind Third Army's advance eastward was Patton's interpretation of exploitation warfare, refined through study of both successful and failed operations. Traditional military doctrine prescribed that, after achieving a breakthrough, attacking forces should consolidate their gains, establish secure supply lines, and broaden the penetration before attempting deep exploitation. Patton rejected this caution as an invitation for enemies to recover and re-establish defences. His concept, drawn from his study of Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry operations in the American Civil War and Heinz Guderian's panzer operations in France in 1940, was to accept risk in exchange for speed. Third Army would bypass German strongpoints rather than reducing them, trusting that isolated German garrisons would surrender to follow-on forces rather than attempt breakouts. Supply lines would stretch thin, accepting vulnerability in exchange for maintaining pressure. Infantry divisions would struggle to keep pace with armour, creating dangerous gaps, but the psychological impact of rapid advance would compensate for tactical weaknesses. Patton sold this concept to Bradley and Eisenhower, not through theoretical arguments, but through results. By the time senior commanders could question whether Third Army was advancing too fast, the results had already validated the approach. The operational execution of Third Army's drive across France required coordination across 4 corps operating on divergent axes but toward complementary objectives. 8th Corps drove into Brittany, capturing St. Malo after a brutal siege, but finding that Brest's German garrison had fortified the city for extended resistance. 12th Corps, commanded by Major General Gilbert Cook, pushed southeast toward Orleans, advancing through territory where German presence had evaporated so completely that French resistance fighters provided the primary opposition to remaining collaborators. 15th Corps, after securing Le Mans, wheeled northeast toward Argentan, positioning itself for a potential encirclement of German forces retreating from Normandy. 20th Corps, commanded by Major General Walton Walker, advanced east through Angers and toward Chartres, maintaining pressure across a front so wide that German commanders couldn't identify where Third Army intended to concentrate. The Four Corps operated with semi-independence, communicating through radio nets that kept Patton's headquarters informed but didn't require approval for tactical decisions. The speed of advance created logistical challenges that Third Army solved through improvisation that alternated between brilliant and reckless. Fuel consumption reached staggering levels. At full operational tempo, Third Army's tanks, trucks, and other vehicles consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily, equivalent to fueling every civilian car in a city the size of Detroit. Supply trucks making round trips from Normandy beaches to frontline units traveled over 300 miles in each direction, wearing out vehicles and exhausting drivers. Ammunition expenditure, while lower than during breakthrough fighting, still required continuous resupply, as even sporadic German resistance consumed stocks. Food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment all demanded transportation assets that Third Army stretched beyond design capacity. Patton's solution was to prioritize ruthlessly. Fuel and ammunition moved first. Everything else, food, mail, personal equipment, moved only when capacity allowed. This created hardship for soldiers who sometimes went days eating monotonous rations and sleeping in the same uniforms, but it kept tanks moving. The human experience of August 1944 for Third Army soldiers oscillated between exhilaration and exhaustion, sometimes within the same hour. Tank crews described advancing through French countryside, where every village brought out civilians, offering wine, cheese, and information about German positions, only to encounter sudden ambushes where bypassed German units struck supply convoys or rear area units. Infantry soldiers riding in half-tracks or on tanks complained of dust that coated everything, mechanical breakdowns that stranded units for hours while maintenance crews scrambled to make repairs, and the surreal experience of advancing so far so fast that maps didn't cover their current positions. Officers described making decisions based on incomplete information, ordering units to capture towns they couldn't locate on available maps, directing traffic through intersections in villages whose names they didn't know. Yet despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, morale soared. Soldiers recognized they were part of something extraordinary. German prisoners, questioned by intelligence officers, consistently expressed shock at American mobility, describing units they'd encountered days earlier now being reported 100 miles away. The psychological impact of Third Army's advance on German forces was as destructive as physical casualties. German defensive doctrine in 1944 emphasized mobile defense, where forces would delay Allied advances through fighting withdrawals to prepared positions, then counterattack when Allies outran their supply lines. This doctrine assumed that Allied forces would advance cautiously, perhaps 5 to 10 miles per day, giving German commanders time to reposition forces and establish new defensive lines. Third Army's 20-mile-per-day advance shattered these assumptions. German units received orders to defend positions only to discover American tanks already behind them. German reinforcements traveled toward reported American positions only to encounter Americans 50 miles beyond where intelligence had located them. German supply convoys, moving forward to support defending units, ran into American roadblocks in areas that should have been secure, German rear areas. Radio intercepts revealed German commanders requesting clarification about which American units they were facing, unable to believe that single American divisions could be reported in multiple locations simultaneously. The liberation of French territory brought emotional scenes that complicated military operations, even as they validated Allied purpose. In every town and village, Third Army soldiers encountered French civilians who had endured 4 years of occupation with varying degrees of collaboration and resistance. Some villages greeted Americans with organized celebrations, French flags, and intelligence about German movements. Others approached liberation with caution, wary of reprisals if Germans returned or punishment if their wartime accommodations with occupiers seemed too comfortable. Women who had relationships with German soldiers faced brutal retribution from resistance members, their heads shaved and bodies marked in public rituals that American soldiers found disturbing. Jewish families who had survived in hiding emerged from cellars and attics, seeking information about relatives deported to camps in the East. Patton's headquarters issued orders that Third Army's mission was military, not civil administration, but soldiers couldn't ignore the human dimension of liberation. Tank crews shared rations with hungry children, Medical units treated French civilians alongside American wounded, and soldiers who had been fighting since Normandy, seeing the joy liberation brought to French families, found renewed purpose in their mission. By August 19th, 18 days after Third Army activated, Patton's forces had reached positions that pre-invasion planners estimated would take 90 days to achieve. Third Army controlled territory from Brittany to Orleans to Chartres, a rough triangle encompassing over 15,000 square miles. They had liberated millions of French civilians, captured thousands of German prisoners, destroyed hundreds of German vehicles and equipment, and advanced an average of 15 miles per day across terrain that varied from open farmland to dense forests to river valleys requiring bridge construction. The advance had cost roughly 16,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, a remarkably low number for the territory gained and enemy defeated. German casualties in Third Army's sector exceeded 65,000, with entire divisions reduced to regimental strength or scattered into ineffective remnants. But the true cost was measured in fuel and vehicle wear. Third Army's trucks had driven the equivalent of crossing the United States. Tank tracks wore out from road marches, not combat. Fuel supplies grew critically short as the distance from Normandy beaches expanded beyond what supply planning had anticipated. The crossing of the Seine River in late August represented both the culmination of Third Army's exploitation and the beginning of the end of unlimited advance. 15th Corps reached the Seine at Mantes-Gassecourt on August 19th, 190 miles from Avranches, and established a bridgehead against disorganized German opposition. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges in record time, and within 48 hours, entire divisions were crossing into territory that German commanders had expected to defend for weeks. Patton, visiting the bridgehead, stood on the riverbank and watched his tanks cross, recognizing that he had achieved something historically significant. Third Army had advanced from Normandy to the Seine, roughly the distance from New York to Washington, in 19 days. Comparable advances in World War I had taken months and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. But even as he savoured the achievement, Patton knew the operational situation was changing. Fuel supplies were critically short. German resistance, while still disorganized, was stiffening as retreating units consolidated. And, most frustrating, Eisenhower's headquarters was making decisions about supply allocation that prioritized other armies over Third Army, decisions that would soon halt his advance entirely. The last days of August brought a mixture of triumph and frustration that would characterize Patton's relationship with higher command for the rest of the war. On August 25th, French and First Army forces liberated Paris, a moment of enormous symbolic importance that Patton watched from a distance with bitter jealousy. Eisenhower had explicitly forbidden Third Army from advancing on Paris, declaring the city would be liberated by French forces for political reasons. Patton, convinced his tanks could have taken Paris a week earlier, fumed in his headquarters and wrote in his diary that political considerations were sabotaging military victory. Meanwhile, his lead elements pushed beyond the Seine, reaching positions less than 200 miles from the German border and less than 150 miles from the Rhine River. For a brief, tantalizing moment, it seemed possible that Third Army might reach Germany's industrial heartland before German forces could organize coherent defenses. Then the fuel ran out and everything changed. August 28th, 1944, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Granville, France, a fuel allocation meeting that would determine the course of the war. Around a conference table sat the senior American commanders in Europe: Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, and Courtney Hodges, commander of First Army. The topic was simple and impossible: how to distribute insufficient fuel supplies among competing operational demands. Third Army needed 400,000 gallons daily to maintain its current operational tempo. First Army needed 300,000. Newly activated Ninth Army required 150,000. And Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British 21st Army Group demanded sufficient allocation to support Operation Market Garden, his plan to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Total daily fuel availability, approximately 600,000 gallons, less than half what was needed. Patton, sitting across from Eisenhower, argued with barely controlled fury that Third Army should receive priority because his forces were closest to decisive objectives, positioned to reach the Rhine and potentially the Ruhr industrial region before winter. Montgomery, communicating through Eisenhower, argued that a concentrated thrust through Holland offered the best chance to end the war in 1944. Eisenhower chose what he called the broad front strategy, distributing supplies across all armies to advance the entire line rather than concentrating resources for a single thrust. The decision, delivered in moderate tones that masked its strategic consequence, meant Third Army's advance would end not because Germans had stopped it, but because Allied logistics couldn't sustain it. The fuel crisis that halted Third Army was the inevitable consequence of operational success that outran logistical planning. Allied pre-invasion plans assumed that by late August, forces would hold a line roughly 70 miles inland from Normandy beaches, supplied through captured French ports that engineers would rehabilitate for cargo operations. Reality bore no resemblance to planning. Third Army alone had advanced 190 miles from its starting point, operating far beyond the range that supply plans anticipated. The ports that were supposed to supply the advance, primarily Brittany harbours like Brest and St. Malo, were either still in German hands or so thoroughly destroyed by German demolitions that they wouldn't be operational for months. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every ration consumed by Third Army had to be trucked from Normandy beaches over roads that grew longer daily as the advance continued. The truck fleet performing this Herculean task, nicknamed the Red Ball Express, consisted of over 6,000 trucks driven by 23,000 men, predominantly black soldiers in segregated transportation units who would receive minimal recognition for their contribution to Allied victory. The Red Ball Express operated under conditions that redefined the limits of human endurance and mechanical reliability. Drivers made round trips that could exceed 700 miles from Normandy to forward supply points near the front, then back to Normandy for another load. These trips took 72 hours or more, driven continuously with minimal rest, often by two-man teams who alternated driving while the other slept in the passenger seat. Trucks travelled in convoy for security, long columns that stretched for miles along French roads, moving at speeds that exceeded safe limits for the vehicles and road conditions. Accidents were common. Trucks rolled over on curves, collided with slower vehicles, broke down from mechanical stress that peacetime maintenance schedules never anticipated. Drivers died from exhaustion, falling asleep at the wheel and crashing. Others died from accidents or occasionally German air attacks that targeted supply convoys with fighter bombers. The casualty rate among Red Ball Express drivers, while never officially compiled, was significant enough that some transportation battalions lost more personnel to traffic accidents than some combat units lost to enemy action. Despite superhuman effort, the Red Ball Express couldn't defy physics or overcome the fundamental logistics problem, distance. In early September, when Third Army's lead elements reached positions roughly 400 miles from Normandy beaches, the round trip for supply trucks exceeded 800 miles. At average speeds of 25 miles per hour, assuming no breakdowns or delays, a single round trip took over 30 hours of continuous driving. This meant each truck could complete roughly 2 trips per week under ideal conditions. To supply Third Army's daily fuel requirement of 400,000 gallons required approximately 1,300 truck trips daily, assuming each truck carried 300 gallons. The Red Ball Express had 6,000 trucks total, supporting multiple armies across the entire front. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding. There was no possible way to deliver the fuel Third Army needed to maintain operational tempo. Something had to give, and what gave was the advance. August 30th, 1944, 4th Armoured Division, advancing toward Commercy on the Meuse River, 90 miles from Metz and the German border. Combat Command A, leading the division's advance, consisted of approximately 60 tanks, 30 armoured infantry vehicles, and supporting artillery. At 1400 hours, the column's lead tanks began sputtering to a halt, their fuel gauges reading empty. Crews performed immediate action drills, checking fuel systems for leaks or mechanical problems, finding nothing wrong except empty tanks. Within 30 minutes, the entire combat command sat immobile on a road in eastern France, 20 miles from the nearest German forces, stopped not by enemy action but by fuel exhaustion. Division headquarters contacted Corps, requesting emergency fuel delivery. Corps contacted Army. Army contacted Communications Zone, the rear echelon command responsible for logistics. The response was devastating. No additional fuel available. Current allocation already distributed. Next shipment not scheduled for 48 hours. Major General John Wood, 4th Armoured's commander, received orders to halt in place and await resupply. The division that had advanced 400 miles in 30 days couldn't move another mile. The fuel crisis struck across 3rd Army's front with brutal simultaneity. 6th Armoured Division halted near Arracourt, 90th Infantry Division, mechanised with trucks and half-tracks, stopped near Commercy. 7th Armoured Division, newly assigned to 3rd Army, halted before even reaching the front. By September 2nd, virtually every mobile unit in 3rd Army sat immobilised, some units within sight of the Moselle River and the German border, all of them helpless to advance. Patton's headquarters, monitoring the situation, watched opportunity evaporate in real time. Intelligence reports showed German forces in full retreat, defensive lines non-existent, pathways to the Rhine River virtually undefended. 3rd Army had the combat power to exploit this situation. But combat power without fuel was merely potential, not capability. Patton raged at his headquarters staff, demanding solutions. Staff officers offered none because none existed. The fuel wasn't available. The broad front strategy meant resources were distributed across multiple armies. And 3rd Army, having advanced furthest and fastest, now paid the price for its success. Patton's response to the fuel crisis mixed legitimate improvisation with outright theft, creating a legend that would both enhance and damage his reputation. Unable to obtain fuel through official channels, Patton ordered his quartermaster officers to requisition supplies from other units. 3rd Army trucks began showing up at 1st Army fuel dumps, presenting falsified paperwork that authorized transfers. When dump commanders questioned the authorizations, 3rd Army officers produced written orders with Patton's signature demanding immediate compliance. Some 1st Army commanders, recognizing the fraud but sympathetic to 3rd Army's operational situation, allowed the transfers. Others refused and reported the incidents to Bradley's headquarters. Over a period of roughly 1 week, 3rd Army acquired approximately 100,000 gallons of fuel through these irregular methods, enough to maintain limited operations but nowhere near enough to resume full-scale advance. Patton, when confronted by Bradley about the theft, offered no apologies and minimal explanation. "My men were fighting, we needed fuel, I got fuel." Bradley, caught between loyalty to Patton and responsibility for maintaining discipline, issued a reprimand but took no further action. The air transport gambit represented Patton's most creative and most controversial attempt to overcome the fuel crisis. In early September, Patton diverted C-47 transport aircraft, officially allocated for airborne operations and medical evacuation, to haul fuel from Normandy to forward airstrips near the front. This unauthorized commandeering of aircraft violated multiple regulations and agreements with the Army Air Forces. When Air Force commanders discovered their planes being loaded with fuel drums instead of paratroopers or wounded soldiers, they protested to Eisenhower's headquarters. But by the time the protests reached decision-makers who could order the practice stopped, Patton's aircraft had already delivered enough fuel to buy 3rd Army 48 hours of limited operations. The fuel, approximately 60,000 gallons total, allowed 4th Armoured Division to resume its advance toward the Moselle River and enabled reconnaissance units to probe German defences around Metz. It couldn't restore 3rd Army's operational tempo, but it prevented complete immobility and demonstrated Patton's willingness to break any rule that interfered with his mission. September 10th, 1944, the window closed. German forces, given nearly 2 weeks to retreat without effective pursuit, reached defensive positions along the Moselle River and in the Metz fortress complex. Reinforcements rushed from Germany's interior and from quieter sectors of the front began arriving to strengthen defences that had been virtually non-existent in late August. Artillery, withdrawn during the retreat, deployed in prepared positions. Infantry dug trenches and established strong points in terrain they'd had time to study. Most critically, German commanders recovered from the psychological shock of 3rd Army's breakthrough and began thinking in terms of defence rather than retreat. By mid-September, when 3rd Army finally received sufficient fuel to resume major operations, the strategic situation had transformed from exploitation of a broken enemy to assault against prepared defences. The opportunity that had existed in late August, when 3rd Army stood within striking distance of the Rhine with minimal opposition, vanished because the fuel needed to exploit that opportunity went instead to support a broad advance that gained less territory than a concentrated thrust might have achieved. The historical debate about the fuel crisis and broad front strategy would continue for decades, with arguments on both sides supported by plausible evidence and hindered by unknowable counterfactuals. Advocates of the broad front, led by Eisenhower and his staff, argued that concentrating resources for a single thrust would have created an unsustainable salient vulnerable to German counterattack on exposed flanks, and that even with unlimited fuel, Third Army couldn't have maintained supply lines stretching to the Ruhr or beyond. Critics, led by Patton in his memoirs and by military historians favouring manoeuvre warfare, argued that Third Army's demonstrated capability in August suggested that with priority fuel allocation, a penetration to the Rhine was achievable, potentially shortening the war by months and saving tens of thousands of Allied casualties. The debate remained unresolved because the alternative history couldn't be tested. What was certain was the outcome that did occur. Third Army halted, German forces recovered, and the war that might have ended in 1944 continued into 1945. The human cost of the fuel crisis was measured not in casualties, but in opportunities lost and hardships endured. Soldiers who had advanced 400 miles in 30 days, who had seen German forces in full retreat, who had believed victory was imminent, now faced the prospect of fighting through fortified positions that could have been bypassed weeks earlier. French civilians in eastern France and western Germany, who might have been liberated in September, remained under German occupation through another brutal winter. German military leadership, given time to stabilize the front and organize coherent defenses, extended the war and ensured that millions more would die before final victory. And Third Army, having proved its capability for mobile warfare on an unprecedented scale, now had to prove it could fight a different kind of war, the grinding attritional battles that Patton despised, and that would cost his army dearly in the months ahead. The tanks that had raced across France sat silent in French fields, their crews staring east toward Germany, knowing they could reach it in days if only they had the fuel to move. The longest mile in Third Army's war wasn't measured in distance, but in frustration, the gap between capability and opportunity, between what could have been achieved and what actually occurred. August 7th, 1944, 0200 hours, Mortagne, France. American infantry of the 30th Division slept in defensive positions on hills overlooking the town when German artillery began falling with sudden, devastating fury. Within minutes, the barrage lifted and tanks emerged from the darkness. Over 100 panzers from 4 SS divisions driving west in the largest German counterattack launched since D-Day. Hitler had personally ordered Operation Lüttich, convinced that a powerful armoured thrust toward Avranches could cut the American breakthrough corridor and trap Patton's Third Army in Brittany. The American infantry, outnumbered and outgunned, held their positions on Hill 314 and other key terrain because they had something the Germans didn't know they had: complete knowledge of the attack before it began. Ultra-intelligence, Britain's decryption of German Enigma communications, had revealed Hitler's plan in detail. American commanders knew the attack was coming, knew which units would participate, and had prepared artillery concentrations and air support to meet it. What Hitler intended as a devastating surprise became a trap that would destroy an entire German army. The strategic context of Operation Lüttich revealed Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of the military situation in Normandy and his increasing disconnection from battlefield reality. By early August, German forces in France faced an impossible strategic position. Allied forces outnumbered them roughly 3-1. Allied air superiority prevented daytime movement and made supply operations hazardous. The Normandy front had collapsed in multiple sectors, with Third Army already exploiting into Brittany and toward the French interior. Conventional military wisdom prescribed an immediate retreat to the Seine River, where German forces could establish a shorter defensive line and preserve combat power for future operations. Hitler rejected this logic, insisting that every inch of French territory be defended and that lost ground be recaptured through counterattack. His order for Operation Lüttich demanded that German armoured forces attack west against the strongest concentration of American power, rather than retreat east to preserve those forces. German field commanders, reading the order at their headquarters, understood it was strategically insane, but years of military discipline and fear of Hitler's reprisals compelled them to execute it. The German attack achieved initial surprise against some American units, but ran into carefully prepared defenses that turned tactical success into strategic catastrophe. SS Panzer divisions, attacking at night to minimize Allied air superiority, overran some American forward positions and penetrated several miles into American lines. But they couldn't dislodge American infantry from critical hills that dominated the roads to Avranches. Hill 314, held by a single battalion of the 30th Division, withstood attacks by an entire SS Panzer division, the American infantry calling down artillery fire that destroyed dozens of German tanks. By mid-morning on August 7th, when weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to operate, the German attack became a shooting gallery. Typhoons, thunderbolts, and other fighter bombers descended on German columns concentrated on narrow roads, destroying tanks, trucks, and infantry with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. By nightfall, Operation Lutic had failed completely, having advanced roughly 7 miles at the cost of dozens of irreplaceable tanks and thousands of casualties. The failure of Lutic created an opportunity that Allied commanders recognized immediately: the chance to encircle and destroy German forces in Normandy rather than simply pushing them back. Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, saw that German armour committed to the Mortain attack was now concentrated in a vulnerable position. 3rd Army, pushing east and north, could wheel back toward Argentan. 1st Canadian Army, attacking south from Caen, could drive toward Falaise. If the two forces met, they would close a pocket containing the bulk of German forces in Normandy, potentially the largest encirclement on the Western Front. Eisenhower approved the plan immediately, designating it the highest priority operation. On August 8th, while German forces at Mortain attempted to disengage from their failed attack, Allied forces began the maneuver that would create the Falaise Pocket. 15th Corps, commanded by Wade Hayslip, executed one of the most impressive operational movements of the campaign, pivoting 90 degrees from its eastward advance to drive north toward Argentan. The maneuver required an entire corps, roughly 40,000 men and thousands of vehicles, to change direction while maintaining contact with the enemy and coordination with adjacent units. Staff officers at Corps headquarters worked through the night of August 8th, plotting routes, coordinating traffic control, and issuing movement orders to subordinate divisions. 2nd French Armoured Division, 5th Armoured Division, and 79th Infantry Division received orders to disengage from their current operations, move north on separate routes to avoid traffic jams, and attack northward to seize Argentan and close the pocket. The complexity was staggering. Units had to know where they were, where they needed to be, which roads they could use, when they should move, and what to do if they encountered German forces during the movement. That the entire operation, executed with minimal confusion, testified to months of training and weeks of combat experience that had forged 15th Corps into a smoothly functioning organization. The race to close the pocket became a competition between Allied maneuver and German retreat, with thousands of German lives hanging on which force moved faster. 2nd French Armoured Division reached Argentan on August 13th, establishing positions that brought them within 20 miles of 1st Canadian Army forces approaching Falaise from the north. Between those two forces, compressed into a steadily shrinking area, sat roughly 240,000 German soldiers from 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, along with thousands of vehicles and hundreds of tanks. German commanders, recognizing the encirclement developing, screamed for permission to retreat east while a narrow corridor still existed. Hitler, still convinced that aggressive action could salvage the situation, initially refused permission to withdraw. By the time he relented on August 14th, Allied forces controlled most of the roads leading east, and the only escape route was a narrow gap, roughly 20 miles wide, between Argentan and Falaise, under constant Allied artillery fire and air attack. August 17, 1944, the Argentangent-Falaise Gap, a controversy that would haunt Allied command relationships for decades. Patton's forces had reached Argentan and established defensive positions. Canadian forces approached Falaise from the north but faced determined German resistance that slowed their advance. Between these two forces lay the gap through which German units were streaming east in desperate retreat. Patton requested permission from Bradley to continue attacking north beyond Argentan to close the gap himself, arguing that 3rd Army could seal the pocket within 24 hours. Bradley refused, ordering Patton to halt at Argentan and hold the southern shoulder while Canadians closed from the north. The decision, made based on concern about Allied forces accidentally engaging each other and uncertainty about Third Army's ability to hold an extended position against German breakout attempts, left the gap open for 4 additional critical days. During those 4 days, between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers escaped the pocket, veterans who would form the nucleus of future German defensive operations. The destruction inside the Falaise pocket, when Allied forces finally closed it on August 21st, was appalling even by the standards of mechanized warfare. Allied artillery and aircraft had pounded the shrinking pocket for nearly 2 weeks, targeting any movement with devastating firepower. German vehicles, horses, and equipment jammed roads in chaotic masses where Allied fighter bombers found target-rich environments. The roads through the gap, particularly near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive and Chambois, became killing grounds where destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and human bodies lay in heaps that physically blocked movement. Polish armoured units, fighting alongside Canadians, sealed the eastern end of the pocket and held against desperate German breakout attempts. American units held the southern shoulder and prevented German forces from escaping south. When Allied forces finally linked up and eliminated the last German resistance, they captured approximately 50,000 German prisoners and counted roughly 10,000 German dead. Material destruction was equally staggering. Over 340 tanks and assault guns destroyed, 2,400 artillery pieces captured or destroyed, thousands of trucks and other vehicles wrecked. The aftermath of Falaise revealed both the achievement and the limitation of Allied encirclement operations. Allied forces had destroyed 2 German armies as effective fighting formations, eliminating equipment and capturing personnel at a rate that Germany couldn't replace. The victory opened eastern France to Allied advance and eliminated organised German resistance west of the Seine River. But the escape of 20,000 to 40,000 German veterans, including experienced officers and NCOs, meant that German forces retained the knowledge and leadership to rebuild divisions and continue resistance. Intelligence officers interrogating captured German prisoners learned that many units had escaped by abandoning their heavy equipment, officers and experienced soldiers fleeing on foot through forests and fields while rearguard units held Allied forces at the gap. These veterans, returning to Germany with knowledge of Allied tactics and capabilities, would make future battles more difficult than they would have been if the pocket had been sealed completely. Patton's reaction to the Argentangent-Falaise operation mixed pride in Third Army's performance with fury at the command decisions that had prevented complete encirclement. Third Army's 15th Corps had executed a 90-degree turn while maintaining offensive operations, demonstrating operational flexibility that validated months of training and doctrinal development. The speed with which Third Army manoeuvred north, established positions at Argentan, and prepared to close the pocket showed what mobile warfare could achieve when executed with skill and aggression. But Patton believed, and would argue for the rest of his life, that Bradley's halt order had squandered an opportunity to end the Normandy campaign more decisively. In his diary, Patton wrote that he could have closed the gap and trapped the entire German force if permitted to continue north. Whether this assessment was accurate remained debatable. What was certain was that the Falaise pocket had demonstrated Third Army's capability to execute complex maneuvers under pressure and had eliminated 2 German armies as effective combat forces, achievements that validated Patton's aggressive operational methods even as command friction prevented maximum exploitation of the victory. September 18, 1944, Fort Driant, Metz, France, a massive pre-World War I fortress complex built into a hillside overlooking the Moselle River. Captain Harry Anderson of the 11th Infantry Regiment led his company toward the fort's outer defences, moving through autumn rain that had turned the ground to soup. Intelligence had described Driant as an outdated relic, built in the 1870s when masonry could withstand artillery. Anderson's company was supposed to capture it in an afternoon. Instead, they discovered that the Germans had transformed a museum piece into a modern death trap, reinforcing 19th century fortifications with concrete, positioning machine guns in interlocking fields of fire, and garrisoning it with troops who had nowhere to retreat. The attack began at 0800 hours. By noon, Anderson's company had advanced 200 yards and suffered 40% casualties. The men who survived took cover in shell craters filling with rainwater, pinned down by fire from positions they couldn't locate and couldn't suppress. For the next 6 weeks, Third Army would assault Fort Driant repeatedly, losing hundreds of men trying to capture a single fortress complex. The army that had raced 400 miles across France in 30 days was learning that speed couldn't substitute for firepower when facing enemies who wouldn't run. The transformation of Third Army's operational environment from exploitation to attrition occurred with brutal suddenness in September and October 1944. After the fuel crisis halted Third Army's advance, German forces used the pause to establish defensive lines that exploited every advantage of terrain and preparation. The Metz Fortress Ring, built by Germans after the Franco-Prussian War and updated in the early 20th century, consisted of 43 interconnected forts arranged in two belts around the city, designed to withstand siege warfare. German engineers had spent years updating these forts, adding reinforced concrete to withstand modern artillery, installing ventilation systems proof against gas attacks, and creating underground passages that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposure. Infantry defences incorporated lessons from years of Eastern Front fighting. Trenches built with overhead cover against artillery, machine gun positions sited for interlocking fire, minefields laid in depth to channel attackers into killing zones. The German soldiers manning these defences, while not the elite SS troops that had fought in Normandy, were experienced veterans fighting on prepared ground with orders to hold at all costs. Third Army's assault on these defences beginning in mid-September revealed the inadequacy of tactics that had worked brilliantly during exploitation operations. Armoured divisions, designed for rapid movement and exploitation of breakthroughs, struggled in terrain that favoured defenders. Tanks advancing toward fortified positions became targets for anti-tank guns, firing from concealed positions at point-blank range. Infantry attacking without adequate artillery preparation suffered devastating casualties from machine gun fire. Units that achieved initial penetrations found themselves isolated when German counterattacks sealed the breach. The aggressive leadership that Patton valued, junior officers leading from the front and taking risks to maintain momentum, resulted in horrific officer casualties that devastated unit cohesion. First lieutenants commanding rifle companies lasted days before becoming casualties. Captains commanding battalions survived weeks if they were lucky or cautious, qualities Patton didn't value. The replacement system, designed to provide individual soldiers to fill casualties, meant that companies and battalions constantly integrated green soldiers who knew neither the terrain nor their comrades, further degrading effectiveness. The weather became an enemy as implacable as German resistance and more universal in its impact. October brought 42 days of continuous rain to eastern France, transforming the battlefield into a nightmare landscape where military operations fought nature as much as Germans. Rivers flooded, rising several feet above normal levels and washing away bridges that engineers had constructed. Roads turned to mud that could swallow vehicles to their axles, requiring hours of labour with chains and winches to extract trucks and tanks. Fields became impassable, channeling movement onto roads that became traffic jams and target zones for German artillery. Visibility dropped to near zero on many days, preventing air support that had been decisive during summer operations. The mud carried a particular horror for infantry soldiers who spent days in waterlogged foxholes, their uniforms soaked, their boots dissolving from constant immersion, their bodies developing trench foot at rates that approached World War I epidemics. Trench foot became a catastrophe that rivaled combat casualties in its impact on Third Army's effectiveness. The condition, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, began with numbness and tingling in feet, progressed to severe pain and tissue damage, and in extreme cases required amputation. Soldiers who developed trench foot became non-combat casualties, evacuated to field hospitals for treatment that could take weeks or months. In November 1944, Third Army reported over 12,000 trench foot cases, more than all combat casualties that month. Medical officers distributed preventive guidance, changed socks frequently, dry feet whenever possible, apply protective ointments. But infantry soldiers fighting in constant rain, living in flooded foxholes, and rarely receiving dry clothing or opportunities to properly care for their feet couldn't follow this guidance. The epidemic revealed a failure of supply planning that prioritized ammunition and fuel over basic soldier welfare items like dry socks and foot powder. Patton, visiting field hospitals and seeing wards filled with trench foot patients, ordered emergency supply efforts to deliver dry socks and boots to frontline units. But the damage was already done. The siege of Fort Driant became symbolic of Third Army's struggle in Lorraine, a microcosm of how prepared defences could neutralise mobile warfare doctrine. 11th Infantry Regiment assaulted the fort repeatedly from September 19th through October 13th, employing tactics that escalated from infantry assault to combined arms attacks involving tanks, artillery, and combat engineers. Nothing worked. Infantry couldn't approach the fort's walls without being cut down by machine gun fire from positions they couldn't suppress. Artillery bombardment, including strikes by heavy guns firing 240mm shells, created impressive explosions but did minimal damage to fortifications built to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment. Combat engineers attempted to blast through walls with explosive charges, but discovered that walls 12 feet thick required charges so large they couldn't be emplaced under fire. Flame-throwing tanks approached close enough to direct fire into embrasures, but were destroyed by anti-tank guns firing from positions inside the fort. After 3 weeks of continuous assault, 11th Infantry had suffered over 3,000 casualties and gained control of approximately one-third of the fort complex. The regiment was pulled out of line, exhausted and depleted, replaced by another unit that would continue the siege. The replacement crisis that developed through October and November revealed fundamental problems with American personnel management that would affect all armies in Europe, but hit Third Army particularly hard given its casualty rates. The individual replacement system, where soldiers were trained in the United States and then shipped individually to Europe to fill casualties in existing units, created perpetual units where veterans who had fought since Normandy served alongside teenagers with 6 weeks of basic training. This mixing destroyed unit cohesion, the bond between soldiers that enabled them to function under stress. New replacements arriving at frontline units at night and going into combat the next morning often didn't know the names of the soldiers in their squad when they were killed or wounded days later. Veterans watching an endless stream of replacements arrive and become casualties developed emotional detachment as a survival mechanism, refusing to learn names or form friendships with soldiers who would likely be dead within a week. The system also failed mathematically. Third Army needed approximately 10,000 replacements monthly to maintain unit strength. The replacement system provided roughly 7,000. The deficit meant that infantry companies designed for 193 soldiers often fielded 120 or fewer, increasing the burden on survivors and making tactical operations more difficult. The limited territorial gains Third Army achieved through September, October, and November came at costs that shocked commanders accustomed to August's cheap victories. From September 1st through November 30th, Third Army advanced approximately 40 miles on its main axis of advance toward the German border, roughly one-third of a mile per day. This compared to the 15 miles per day average during August's exploitation. Casualties for this period exceeded 55,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing, more than the entire casualty count from the August breakthrough and exploitation. German casualties in Third Army's sector, while difficult to calculate precisely, probably exceeded 80,000, including substantial numbers of prisoners, but German defensive positions meant they could inflict disproportionate casualties while preserving combat power. Material attrition was equally brutal. Third Army lost hundreds of tanks to German anti-tank guns, mines, and mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired under field conditions. Trucks wore out from constant use on deteriorating roads. Artillery pieces fired so many rounds that barrels wore out and required replacement. The Battle of Metz, which consumed much of Third Army's effort through November, demonstrated both the strength of prepared defences and the eventual effectiveness of methodical operations. 20th Corps, commanded by Major General Walton Walker, isolated Metz from the south and east, while elements of 12th Corps attacked from the west. German defenders, numbering roughly 15,000 initially, fought from fortified positions that gave them enormous defensive advantages. American forces responded with tactics that emphasized preparation over speed. Extensive artillery bombardment before attacks, careful coordination between infantry and supporting arms, systematic reduction of defensive positions rather than attempts at rapid breakthrough. Fort Driant finally fell on November 8th after a siege lasting 6 weeks, not to assault but because German defenders evacuated the position when American forces threatened to surround it. The city of Metz itself fell on November 22nd, after house-to-house fighting that destroyed much of the urban area and cost both sides thousands of casualties. The victory, when it came, felt less like triumph than relief that a brutal fight had finally ended. The human cost of the Lorraine stalemate was measured not just in casualties but in psychological exhaustion that affected every soldier in Third Army. Men who had fought continuously since Normandy, who had experienced the exhilaration of August's breakthrough and the frustration of the fuel halt, now endured grinding combat that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond capturing the next fortified village. Combat fatigue, the condition where soldiers lost the ability to function under stress, affected thousands of men who had reached the limit of human endurance. Unlike the slapping incident in Sicily, Patton's response to combat fatigue in Lorraine showed evolution in his understanding. He established rest areas where exhausted units could be pulled from the line for brief periods, ordered medical officers to treat combat fatigue as a legitimate medical condition, and generally accepted that even aggressive soldiers had limits. But the rest areas could only accommodate a fraction of the army, and soldiers often returned to combat before fully recovering. The Lorraine campaign ground men down in ways that August's rapid warfare hadn't, creating an army that was tactically competent but emotionally exhausted. November 16th, 1944, Patton stood at a field hospital outside Metz, visiting wounded soldiers in a scene that repeated itself hundreds of times through his career, but took on particular poignancy given the circumstances. A young private, both feet bandaged from severe trench foot, asked Patton when Third Army would start moving again like it had in August. Patton, caught between honesty and the need to maintain morale, told the soldier that Third Army would resume the offensive soon, that the current fighting was temporary preparation for future breakthroughs. Walking back to his headquarters vehicle, Patton confided to his aide that he had lied to the soldier, that he didn't know when Third Army would move rapidly again, that the operational environment had changed in ways that made August's success impossible to repeat. The admission revealed Patton's growing understanding that mobile warfare required not just aggressive doctrine and competent organization, but specific conditions, disorganized enemies, adequate supplies, favorable terrain that couldn't be commanded into existence. Third Army had proved it could exploit opportunity brilliantly. Now it had to prove it could create opportunity through methodical operations that Patton found personally distasteful but professionally necessary. The lessons learned in Lorraine's mud and blood would make Third Army a more complete fighting force, but the education was expensive beyond anything Patton had anticipated. September 22nd, 1944, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. A meeting that would define the strategic direction of the war in Europe. Patton sat in a conference room across from Eisenhower, Bradley at Eisenhower's side, maps of France and Germany spread across the table. The topic was resource allocation and strategic priority. Patton argued, with barely controlled passion, that Third Army should receive fuel priority to resume its drive toward the Rhine River and Germany's industrial heartland. His forces were closest to decisive objectives, positioned to potentially reach the Ruhr industrial region before German defences could solidify. Every day of delay allowed Germans to strengthen positions that would cost thousands of Allied lives to overcome. Eisenhower, maintaining the calm demeanour that made him an effective coalition commander, explained his decision to support the broad front strategy, advancing all Allied armies simultaneously rather than concentrating resources for a single thrust. Montgomery's Operation Market Garden would receive priority for northern operations. First Army would maintain pressure in the centre. Third Army would continue operations but within resource constraints that prevented unlimited advance. Patton left the meeting convinced that political considerations and personal favouritism toward Montgomery was sabotaging military victory. Eisenhower, watching Patton leave, knew he had disappointed his most aggressive commander, but believed he had made the strategic decision that balanced military effectiveness with political necessity. The Patton-Eisenhower relationship was complicated by history, personality, and organizational position in ways that affected every strategic decision from Normandy to Germany. The two men had known each other since the 1920s, when both were junior officers developing theories about armoured warfare. Eisenhower had served as Patton's subordinate in the interwar years, learning tank tactics under Patton's instruction. But by 1944, Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander, responsible for coordinating American, British, Canadian, and French forces in the most complex coalition operation in history, while Patton commanded one army among many. Eisenhower's responsibilities required balancing military effectiveness against political considerations that Patton dismissed as irrelevant. British forces, under Montgomery's command, represented a substantial portion of Allied combat power, and brought political influence that Eisenhower couldn't ignore. French forces, while smaller, carried symbolic importance for a nation reclaiming its territory from occupation. American forces, split among multiple armies, had to share resources even when concentration might bring military advantages. The broad front versus narrow front debate that dominated Allied strategic planning from September 1944 through the end of the war represented fundamentally different approaches to coalition warfare. The broad front strategy, which Eisenhower adopted and defended against criticism from both Patton and Montgomery, prescribed advancing all Allied armies more or less simultaneously across the entire front. This approach had military advantages. It prevented German forces from concentrating against a single thrust, maintained pressure across multiple sectors, and reduced the risk of catastrophic failure if a single advance encountered unexpected resistance. It also had political advantages crucial to coalition warfare. It gave each national contingent a role in victory, maintained influence for different commanders, and avoided the appearance that one nation's army was winning the war while others sat idle. But the broad front consumed enormous resources, distributing fuel, ammunition, and supplies across hundreds of miles of front rather than concentrating them for decisive operations. The narrow front alternative, which Patton advocated and which Montgomery also supported, though with himself leading the thrust, proposed concentrating Allied resources for a single powerful advance toward Germany's heartland. Patton's version of this strategy envisioned Third Army driving east with priority for all available fuel and supplies, crossing the Rhine south of the Ruhr, then driving northeast to encircle Germany's industrial region and potentially forcing German surrender before winter. The operational logic was compelling. Third Army in late August stood roughly 140 miles from the Rhine, positioned to potentially reach it within days if properly supplied. German defences between Third Army and the Rhine were minimal, disorganised remnants of units destroyed in Normandy without time to establish coherent defensive lines. The Ruhr region, if captured, would deprive Germany of approximately 60% of its coal production and much of its steel manufacturing capacity. But the narrow front strategy carried enormous risks. It would create an extended salient vulnerable to German counterattacks on the flanks, require supply lines stretching hundreds of miles through potentially hostile territory, and stake Allied victory on a single operational axis where unexpected reverses could prove catastrophic. The decision to support Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's airborne and armoured thrust into the Netherlands, rather than providing maximum support to Third Army, revealed Eisenhower's political calculations and military judgments. Market Garden proposed dropping 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges across multiple rivers in Holland, creating a corridor that British armoured forces would exploit to cross the Rhine and position themselves to advance into northern Germany. The operation appealed to Eisenhower for several reasons. It demonstrated action in the northern sector, addressing British political pressure for visible progress. It utilised airborne divisions that were available and equipped for the mission, requiring different resources than Third Army needed. And it potentially outflanked German defensive positions in a way that complemented operations further south. The operation launched on September 17th and failed by September 25th, unable to secure all objectives and losing thousands of airborne troops in the process. The fuel and supplies dedicated to Market Garden, if allocated to Third Army, might have enabled Patton to reach the Moselle River in strength and potentially cross before German defences solidified. November 10th, 1944. A press conference at Shah F headquarters where correspondents questioned why the rapid advance through France had stalled. Eisenhower explained the strategic situation. Allied forces faced increasingly strong German resistance, supply lines stretched hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches, weather prevented effective air support, and the enemy defended on terrain that favoured defence. Correspondents, many of whom had accompanied Third Army during August and witnessed its capabilities, asked why Patton's forces couldn't resume their advance. Eisenhower, choosing words carefully, explained that all Allied armies faced similar constraints, that resources had to be distributed to maintain pressure across the front, and that concentration of resources in one sector would create vulnerabilities elsewhere. What Eisenhower didn't say, but what many correspondents understood, was that coalition politics demanded that British forces received resources roughly proportional to American forces, despite American armies being larger and, many believed, more effective. The unspoken political dimension of military planning created friction that affected every strategic decision. December 8th, 1944, Patton presented Eisenhower with a bold operational plan. Third Army would abandon current operations in the Saar, wheel north, drive through the Eifel region into Germany, and threaten the Rhine River from an unexpected axis. The plan represented Patton's continuing faith in mobile warfare and his frustration with methodical operations in Lorraine. Eisenhower listened to the presentation, studied the maps, and rejected the proposal. His reasoning was practical. Third Army lacked the fuel to execute such a maneuver. Abandoning the Saar would surrender hard-won gains and allow German forces to redeploy, and the operation would create the kind of exposed salient that broad front strategy was designed to prevent. Patton, according to his diary, left the meeting convinced that Eisenhower lacked the boldness to win decisively, that political considerations were preventing military victory, and that the war would last months longer than necessary because of excessive caution. Eisenhower, in his own correspondence, expressed frustration with Patton's inability to understand coalition politics and strategic constraints, but also admitted that Patton's aggressive instincts had achieved results that more cautious commanders couldn't match. The performance paradox that defined Third Army's 1944 operations was that Patton achieved spectacular results despite receiving the lowest supply priority among major American commands. Third Army received approximately 25% of available supplies during September through November, despite fielding roughly 40% of American combat power in theater. This allocation reflected both Eisenhower's strategic priorities, supporting market garden and First Army operations, and punishment for Patton's supply theft and unauthorized actions. Yet Third Army advanced further, captured more territory, took more prisoners, and inflicted more casualties on German forces than any other Allied army during this period. This achievement validated Patton's operational methods, his emphasis on speed and aggression, his organizational innovations, and his willingness to accept risk in exchange for results. But it also reinforced Eisenhower's concerns about giving Patton unlimited resources, wondering what disasters might result from Patton's risk-taking if he had sufficient supplies to pursue every aggressive impulse. The telephone call on December 19th, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, would reverse the Patton-Eisenhower dynamic in dramatic fashion. German forces had launched a massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes, smashing through American lines and threatening to reach the Meuse River. Eisenhower, facing the greatest crisis of his command, needed aggressive action to contain the breakthrough and counterattack the German penetration. He called Patton and asked how quickly Third Army could disengage from the Saar, wheel 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge. Patton, who had anticipated this possibility and secretly prepared contingency plans, calmly replied, "I can attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions." The room at Eisenhower's headquarters erupted in disbelief. Moving an entire corps 100 miles through winter weather, while maintaining combat operations in another sector within 48 hours, violated every conventional military timeline. But Patton delivered on his promise, executing the maneuver that would save Bastogne and demonstrate that Third Army's capabilities matched Patton's aggressive rhetoric. The crisis validated Patton's methods and temporarily resolved the strategic debate. For the duration of the Bulge campaign, Patton would receive priority for supplies and freedom to operate aggressively. The Titan who had fought Eisenhower's caution for months would become the savior Eisenhower desperately needed. The Patton-Eisenhower relationship would never be simple friendship or pure professional respect, but rather a complicated partnership where each man brought capabilities the other lacked. Eisenhower's genius was political and organizational, maintaining coalition unity, balancing competing demands, and creating conditions where talented subordinates could excel. Patton's genius was tactical and operational, exploiting opportunities with speed and aggression that more cautious commanders couldn't match. Together, despite constant friction and fundamental disagreements about strategy, they formed a command relationship that helped win the war in Europe. Separated, each man's limitations would have been more apparent. The collision between Patton's aggressive instincts and Eisenhower's political constraints created sparks that illuminated both the possibilities of mobile warfare and the constraints of coalition politics. Understanding Third Army's achievements requires understanding this relationship, how Patton's brilliance was both enabled and constrained by Eisenhower's command decisions, and how the tension between them shaped the course of the war in ways that pure military logic alone couldn't have achieved. October 15th, 1944. A muddy field outside Nancy, France, transformed into a classroom where Third Army was learning from its mistakes. Officers and NCOs from units pulled off the line for brief rest gathered around demonstration areas where instructors showed new techniques for combined arms warfare. Tank commanders learned how to coordinate with infantry squads, using radios to direct supporting fire and movement. Infantry lieutenants practiced calling for artillery support using new procedures that reduced the time from request to shells landing from 15 minutes to under 5. Engineer sergeants demonstrated techniques for breaching fortifications using shaped charges and Bangalore torpedoes, sharing lessons learned from costly assaults on Metz forts. This informal school, established by Patton's training officer and operating whenever units cycled through rest areas, represented Third Army's recognition that tactics effective during exploitation operations failed against prepared defences. The army that had raced across France now had to evolve, combining speed with the firepower and combined arms coordination necessary to crack fortified positions. The education would be expensive, paid for in casualties during operations that revealed weaknesses, but it would transform Third Army from a purely exploitation force into an organization capable of both breakthrough and sustained offensive operations. The tank infantry integration that Third Army developed through autumn 1944 addressed a fundamental problem that had plagued American forces since North Africa. Tanks and infantry operated as separate entities with different cultures, training, and tactical approaches. Armored divisions designed for mobile warfare emphasized speed and maneuver, training to exploit breakthroughs rather than create them. Infantry divisions designed for sustained combat emphasized firepower and methodical advance, training to reduce prepared positions but lacking the mobility to exploit success. When these forces operated together, which doctrine prescribed but training rarely practiced, coordination broke down under combat stress. Tank commanders, protected by armor and communicating by radio, couldn't effectively coordinate with infantry squads that communicated by shouting and hand signals. Infantry, trained to take cover when under fire, couldn't keep pace with tanks that kept moving to avoid becoming stationary targets. The solution developed in Third Army's schools and refined through combat was organizational. Create permanent tank infantry teams at the platoon level, train them together, and keep them together through combat. The implementation of tank infantry teams required changes to doctrine, organization, and equipment that Third Army pioneered and that other armies would eventually adopt. Each tank platoon, normally 5 tanks and 20 crew members, received an attached infantry squad of 12 soldiers who rode on the tanks during movement and dismounted to fight alongside armor during combat. Each infantry platoon received a tank section of 2 or 3 tanks that provided mobile firepower and protection. These combined teams trained together during rest periods, with tank commanders and infantry squad leaders learning each other's capabilities and limitations. Critically, Third Army retrofitted tanks with external radio speakers that allowed tank commanders to speak to accompanying infantry without exposing themselves, solving the communication problem that had prevented effective coordination. The teams developed standard procedures. Tanks would provide covering fire, while infantry advanced to flush out anti-tank positions. Infantry would protect tanks from close assault, and both elements would maneuver together using signals that both understood. This integration, refined through October and November combat, would become standard American practice by 1945 and remain doctrine for decades after the war. The artillery revolution that Third Army pioneered through late 1944 transformed field artillery from supporting arm to dominant battle-winning system. The innovation was time on target, a firing technique where multiple artillery battalions synchronized their fire so that shells from all batteries arrived at the target simultaneously, denying enemies the warning that traditional sequential firing provided. Implementation required sophisticated calculations. Each battery had to compute firing data, accounting for their distance from target shell trajectory and time of flight, then time their firing so that shells with different flight times all arrive simultaneously. Third Army's artillery officers developed the mathematical tables and communication procedures to make this work, creating fire direction centers that could coordinate 12 or more battalions, 144 guns, firing at a single target with shells arriving within a 10-second window. The effect on German defenders was devastating. Traditional artillery bombardment gave soldiers time to take cover after initial shells landed. Time on target gave no warning. The first indication of incoming fire was when hundreds of shells arrived simultaneously, creating casualties and psychological shock that traditional bombardment couldn't match. Night fighting capabilities that Third Army developed through autumn and winter, 1944 gave American forces advantages that German defenders couldn't match. Standard practice in all armies was to minimize nighttime offensive operations because darkness prevented effective coordination and control. Units that attacked at night risked getting lost, firing on friendly forces, or blundering into unexpected enemy positions. Third Army rejected this limitation, recognizing that nighttime attacks offered tactical advantages that justified the coordination difficulties. Darkness neutralized German defensive advantages like long-range observation and fields of fire. It prevented German reinforcements from moving efficiently, and it reduced German artillery effectiveness because forward observers couldn't adjust fire accurately. Third Army units practiced night movement using compass bearings and pace counting, learned to navigate by terrain features they could identify by touch, and developed light discipline procedures that prevented accidental illumination. By December, Third Army was conducting roughly 30% of attacks at night, compared to less than 5% for other Allied armies, giving them operational flexibility that German commanders couldn't predict or counter effectively. The armoured infantry development that Third Army pursued addressed the mobility gap that prevented infantry from keeping pace with tank advances. Standard infantry divisions moved on foot or in trucks, able to travel reasonable distances on roads but unable to accompany tanks across country or deploy quickly under fire. Third Army's solution was to mechanize infantry companies assigned to armoured divisions using M3 half-tracks, lightly armoured vehicles that could carry a full squad and traverse terrain tanks could negotiate. The half-tracks weren't fighting vehicles, their armour barely stopped small arms fire, but they gave infantry tactical mobility that foot-mobile units lacked. Infantry could ride half-tracks to an objective, dismount under the vehicle's covering fire, and manoeuvre on foot while the half-tracks displaced to provide support. This mechanization required training. Infantry learned to mount and dismount quickly, to coordinate movement with tank units, and to use the half-tracks machine gun for supporting fire. By winter 1944, Third Army's armoured divisions fielded mechanized infantry battalions that could maintain operational pace with tank battalions, enabling sustained advance that mixed armoured divisions in other armies couldn't match. The air-ground coordination that Third Army developed with 19th Tactical Air Command, commanded by Brigadier General Otto Weyland, created what was effectively a flying artillery force under ground control. The system's innovation was responsiveness. Fighter bombers orbited over the battlefield in cab-rank formations, waiting for ground controllers to direct them to targets. Tank commanders or infantry officers encountering enemy resistance could radio requests to air liaison officers embedded with ground units. Those liaison officers forwarded requests to 19th TAC operations centres, which vectored the closest available aircraft to the target. Under ideal conditions, the time from initial contact with enemy forces to bombs landing was under 15 minutes, fast enough that enemy forces couldn't disperse or take effective cover. The system required sophisticated radio networks, trained liaison personnel, and fighter bomber pilots willing to deliver ordnance close to friendly forces, all capabilities that Third Army and 19th TAC developed through months of coordination. By winter, Third Army commanders thought of air support as available firepower similar to artillery, an assumption that gave them tactical flexibility other forces lacked. Reconnaissance doctrine evolved from passive observation to aggressive armed reconnaissance that shaped operations. Rather than simply reporting enemy positions, traditional reconnaissance units operated cautiously, avoiding contact while gathering information about enemy locations and movements. Third Army's reconnaissance units, particularly mechanized cavalry squadrons equipped with armored cars and light tanks, operated aggressively, pushing deep into enemy territory to provoke response that revealed German dispositions and capabilities. These units screened 30 to 50 miles ahead of main forces, radioing reports about enemy strength, defensive positions, and movement. When reconnaissance encountered weak resistance, they attacked to develop the situation, determining whether they had found an outpost or a main defensive line. This aggressive approach produced better intelligence than passive observation, though at higher cost in casualties and equipment. But Patton considered the cost acceptable because accurate intelligence enabled main forces to concentrate against weak points rather than conducting time-consuming reconnaissance in force with entire divisions. The maintenance philosophy that Patton drilled into every unit in Third Army, fix it forward, never retreat for repairs, created sustainment practices that kept more vehicles operational than standard maintenance procedures achieved. Traditional practice evacuated damaged vehicles to rear area depots, where specialized mechanics performed repairs using proper tools and spare parts. This ensured quality repairs but removed vehicles from combat for days or weeks. Third Army's approach pushed maintenance forward, with each tank battalion fielding recovery vehicles and mobile repair sections that could replace engines, transmissions, and other major components under field conditions. Tank crews received training in field maintenance beyond what other armies provided, learning to perform repairs that were supposed to require depot-level mechanics. The approach sacrificed some repair quality and properly documented maintenance records, but it kept vehicles in combat. A tank that threw a track got repaired where it stopped. A tank with engine trouble got a new engine installed by its battalion maintenance section overnight. This forward maintenance kept Third Army's operational rate, the percentage of vehicles available for combat, significantly higher than other armies achieved, despite operating at higher tempo that should have increased breakdown rates. December 3rd, 1944. A demonstration for visiting officers from 1st and 9th Armies, showcasing 3rd Army's integrated capabilities. A simulated assault on a fortified village using tank infantry teams, coordinated artillery fire, and air support. The demonstration began with time-on-target artillery striking, the objective simultaneously with fighter-bomber strikes directed by ground controllers. Tank infantry teams advanced using rehearsed procedures, tanks providing covering fire while infantry cleared positions. The entire assault, from first artillery rounds to final position secured, lasted 18 minutes and demonstrated lethality and coordination that impressed the visiting officers. One observer noted that Third Army had developed capabilities that looked more like 1950 than 1944, combining traditional arms in ways that maximized each element's strengths. The demonstration wasn't propaganda or show, it was validation of months of development, training, and refinement paid for in combat casualties. Third Army had learned from its failures in Lorraine, adapted its methods, and emerged as a more capable and flexible fighting force. The lessons would be tested within days when German forces launched their Ardennes offensive, and Patton would be called upon to execute the most remarkable maneuver of the war. November 8th, 1944, Patton's headquarters, Nancy, France. The final planning conference for Third Army's assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive barrier. Around the map table sat corps commanders, artillery chiefs, engineer officers, and intelligence staff, studying terrain maps and aerial photographs of fortifications that stretched from Luxembourg to Switzerland. The Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by Germans, represented the most extensive defensive system built since the Maginot Line, over 18,000 bunkers and pillboxes, 400 miles of fortifications, anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth that looked like rows of concrete pyramids, and minefields containing millions of mines. German propaganda claimed the West Wall was impregnable. American intelligence estimated that a sustained assault would require weeks of preparation and accept thousands of casualties. Patton, studying the intelligence assessments, announced his plan. Third Army would assault with 12 divisions across a 60-mile front, supported by the largest artillery concentration American forces had yet assembled in the European theatre. The preparation would last 2 weeks, not months. The assault would begin November 9th, and Third Army would penetrate the Siegfried Line and reach the Saar River within 30 days. His staff, accustomed to Patton's aggressive timelines, understood this wasn't bravado but operational calculus. Third Army had spent 2 months learning how to crack fortifications. Now they would prove they had mastered the skill. The Siegfried line construction revealed German engineering expertise and defensive doctrine developed through World War I experience. The fortifications consisted of multiple elements designed to work in combination. Concrete bunkers built with walls 6 to 8 feet thick and roofs reinforced with steel beams housed machine guns or anti-tank guns with interlocking fields of fire. Dragon's Teeth, rows of concrete pyramids, roughly 4 feet high, created barriers that tanks couldn't cross without exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. Minefields, laid in belts several hundred yards deep, channeled attackers into killing zones covered by bunker fire. Infantry trenches, built with overhead cover and connecting tunnels, allowed defenders to move without exposure. Rivers and streams, incorporated into the defensive system, provided additional barriers that required bridging under fire. The fortifications weren't continuous but arranged in depth, so that forces penetrating the first belt encountered second and third belts beyond. German defensive doctrine prescribed using the west wall to delay Allied advances, while mobile reserves counterattack penetrations, turning static defense into a system of fighting withdrawal and local counterattack. Third Army's preparation for the assault demonstrated how much the organization had learned from Lorraine's failures. Artillery units deployed over 1,400 guns, from 75mm pack howitzers to massive 240mm Black Dragon guns that fired shells weighing 360 pounds. Artillery officers surveyed firing positions, calculated range and deflection data, and stockpiled ammunition. The preparatory bombardment would fire over 500,000 rounds in 14 days, the largest sustained artillery bombardment delivered by American forces in Europe. Combat engineers assembled specialized equipment, Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps through wire obstacles, shaped charges to penetrate bunker walls, dozer blades to mount on tanks for clearing Dragon's Teeth, and thousands of anti-tank mines to secure captured positions against German counterattack. Infantry units trained on mock-ups of west wall bunkers, practicing assault procedures until movements became automatic. Tank infantry teams rehearsed coordination, ensuring that every platoon understood its role in the assault. November 9th through November 22nd. The artillery preparation for 14 days, Third Army's guns pounded Siegfried Line fortifications with systematic intensity. Fire direction officers divided the defensive belt into grid squares, assigned artillery battalions to each square, and scheduled bombardment patterns to ensure every position received attention. Heavy guns targeted bunkers, trying to crack concrete through repeated impacts. Medium guns fired at infantry positions and supply routes. Light guns delivered harassing fire to prevent German reinforcement and resupply. The bombardment wasn't continuous but pulsed, intense periods of fire followed by silence designed to trick defenders into leaving protective cover. Aerial reconnaissance photographed the impact, providing battle damage assessment that adjusted subsequent bombardment. German defenders sheltering in fortifications designed to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment survived better than American planners hoped. But the bombardment achieved psychological effects beyond physical destruction. German soldiers, enduring 2 weeks of sustained artillery fire, suffered exhaustion and stress that degraded their combat effectiveness when the ground assault finally came. December 3rd, 1944, the ground assault began. 12th Corps attacked in the north towards Saarlauten, 20th Corps in the centre towards Saarbrücken, and elements of 6th Corps in the south towards Zweibrücken. The assaults followed patterns refined through months of combat. Artillery preparation shifted from bombardment to rolling barrage, shells landing progressively forward to suppress defenders as assault troops advanced. Tank infantry teams moved toward bunkers using terrain for cover, infantry providing security, while tanks maneuvered for direct fire against bunker embrasures. Combat engineers followed assault teams, placing demolition charges against bunker walls or directing tanks with dozer blades to bury bunkers under rubble. The German defenders fought with skill and determination, emerging from bunkers to engage advancing Americans with machine gun fire and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, then retreating underground when American fire intensified. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, each bunker requiring minutes to hours to reduce depending on its construction and garrison. The Dragon's Teeth obstacles proved less formidable than intelligence estimated, thanks to engineering innovation. Third Army developed specifically for this assault. Standard procedures for crossing Dragon's Teeth involved engineers placing explosives to blast gaps, a time-consuming process that exposed soldiers to defensive fire. Third Army engineers developed an alternative. Tanks fitted with dozer blades could push the concrete pyramids over through brute force, creating lanes for following vehicles. The modification was simple: weld dozer blades from construction equipment onto tank hulls, but the tactical impact was dramatic. Tank dozer teams advanced to Dragon's Teeth barriers, pushed aside obstacles while infantry provided covering fire, and created passages within minutes rather than hours. German defenders, expecting obstacles to channel American forces into killing zones, found Americans creating new passage points faster than defensive fire could stop them. Within 72 hours of the assault's start, Third Army had breached the first belt of Siegfried Line fortifications in multiple locations, achieving penetrations that intelligence had estimated would require weeks. 4th Armoured Division's breakthrough on December 6th demonstrated what happened when Third Army's combined arms capabilities exploited German defensive weaknesses. The division, attacking toward Singling, concentrated its combat power against a narrow sector where intelligence identified a gap between fortified areas. Artillery preparation, fighter bomber strikes, and tank fire suppressed German positions. Tank infantry teams penetrated the first defensive belt, then exploited into the gap beyond, advancing 12 miles in a single day. This deep penetration, the deepest achieved since August's exploitation across France, created a crisis for German defenders. 4th Armoured threatened to outflank fortified positions on both sides of the penetration, forcing German units to retreat from positions they might otherwise have held. More critically, the breakthrough demonstrated that the Siegfried Line, despite its impressive construction, suffered from the same weakness as all linear defences. It could be penetrated if attackers concentrated sufficient force at selected points, and penetrations threatened the entire defensive system. The human cost of breaking the Siegfried Line was severe but acceptable by the grim calculus of attritional warfare. Third Army suffered approximately 27,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing during November and early December operations against the West Wall. These losses fell disproportionately on infantry rifle companies that conducted the actual bunker assaults, units that might lose 50% strength in days of continuous combat. Replacement soldiers arrived from depots and rear areas and went into combat within hours, often dying before learning the names of soldiers in their squads. Officers leading assaults suffered particularly high casualties, first and second lieutenants commanding rifle platoons lasting days before being killed or wounded. The casualty rates, while horrific, compared favourably to casualties during World War I, assaults on prepared defences, where divisions lost thousands of men for gains measured in yards. Third Army's combination of overwhelming artillery preparation, air support, and combined arms tactics achieved breakthrough at cost that, while heavy, was sustainable and acceptable given the strategic importance of penetrating Germany's western defences. German casualties during the Saar offensive exceeded 30,000, including roughly 10,000 prisoners captured when penetrations cut off defensive positions, but German losses were measured as much in capability as casualties. Units that retreated from West Wall positions abandoned heavy equipment, artillery pieces, and fortifications that represented years of construction effort. The loss of the Siegfried Line in Third Army's sector meant German forces had no prepared defensive positions between the Saar River and the Rhine, forcing them to defend in open terrain where American mobility and firepower advantages were decisive. German commanders recognized they'd fought their best defensive battle and failed to prevent Third Army's breakthrough, leaving them uncertain whether any position could be held against properly prepared and supported American assault. The psychological impact rivaled the tactical consequences. German defenders who had survived the Saar fighting lost faith that fortifications or terrain could stop American advances. December 15th, 1944. Third Army units reached the Saar River in strength, having penetrated the Siegfried Line, advanced through 40 miles of fortified terrain, and positioned themselves to cross into Germany proper. Engineers surveyed crossing sites, accumulated bridging equipment, and prepared assault boats. Artillery units displaced forward to support the crossing. Infantry divisions designated assault battalions to conduct the initial crossing and establish bridgeheads. Everything was prepared for Third Army to cross the Saar, penetrate deeper into Germany, and potentially reach the Rhine before Christmas. Then, on December 16th, German forces launched their Ardennes offensive 200 miles to the north, smashing through American lines in the largest German offensive operation of the war on the Western Front. Eisenhower called Patton that night, asking how quickly Third Army could disengage from the Saar, wheel 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton, who had secretly prepared contingency plans for exactly this scenario, replied that he could attack in 48 hours. Third Army's Saar offensive, which had just achieved breakthrough after months of preparation and weeks of bloody fighting, would be halted before exploitation could occur. But the capabilities Third Army had developed, the combined arms proficiency, the artillery coordination, the aggressive leadership, would now be tested in the most critical battle of the war. December 19th, 1944, 10:30 hours, Verdun, France. A city scarred by World War I's longest battle, now hosting a conference that would determine whether Germany's last offensive could succeed. Around a table in a French barracks sat Eisenhower, Bradley, Devers, and Patton, studying maps showing the disaster unfolding in the Ardennes. German forces, attacking on December 16th with over 200,000 troops and 600 tanks, had penetrated 40 miles into American lines, surrounded the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division fought encircled, and threatened to reach the Meuse River and potentially split Allied armies in half. Eisenhower, confronting the greatest crisis of his command, needed immediate counterattack to contain the penetration and relieve Bastogne before its garrison was overwhelmed. He turned to Patton and asked when Third Army could attack. The room expected Patton to request a week, maybe 10 days, to disengage from the Saar, move units 100 miles north, and organize an assault against the southern flank of the German Bulge. Instead, Patton looked at Eisenhower calmly and stated, "I can attack on December 22nd with 3 divisions." The room erupted. Staff officers protested that moving an entire corps over 100 miles in 48 hours was impossible. Patton smiled and said he'd already given preliminary orders. The staff thought Patton was bluffing or delusional. Eisenhower, who knew Patton better, recognized truth. Third Army was about to execute the most remarkable maneuver in modern warfare. The preparation that made Patton's promise possible had begun days before the Verdun conference, driven by Patton's instinct that German forces might attempt something desperate. On December 12th, 4 days before the Ardennes offensive began, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a 90-degree turn northward. Staff officers, working in secret to avoid telegraphing expectations to higher headquarters, identified routes that Third Army units could use to move north, calculated fuel and ammunition requirements for the movement and subsequent operations, and drafted warning orders to corps commanders about potential mission changes. When German forces attacked on December 16th, Patton's staff updated these plans with current unit locations and refined movement schedules. By December 18th, while Eisenhower's headquarters were still assessing the crisis, Patton had a complete operational plan ready for execution. The plan designated 3rd Corps, commanded by Major General John Milliken, to conduct the relief operation using 3rd Infantry Division, 4th Armoured Division, and 80th Infantry Division, roughly 45,000 men and 400 tanks, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces and thousands of trucks. The execution of Third Army's turn north required organizational capabilities and leadership discipline that few military organizations could match. On December 19th, after receiving Eisenhower's order at the Verdun conference, Patton returned to his headquarters and issued execute orders to his corps commanders. 3rd Corps would disengage from the Saar immediately, move north on assigned routes, and attack toward Bastogne on December 22nd. 12th Corps would extend its sector to cover positions. 3rd Corps was vacating, maintaining pressure on German forces in the Saar to prevent them from detecting Third Army's redeployment. 20th Corps would continue current operations, holding German forces in place. The movement orders specified routes, departure times, traffic control measures, and radio frequencies. Military police received orders to position at every major intersection along movement routes, directing traffic to prevent collisions between units moving on converging roads. Fuel and ammunition convoys pre-positioned along routes to enable moving units to refuel and rearm without stopping. Medical units prepared to displace northward to support operations in the new sector. The scale of movement that 3rd Corps executed in 72 hours challenged every assumption about what mechanized armies could achieve under winter conditions. Approximately 250,000 soldiers, 133,000 vehicles, and 600 tanks moved from positions near the German border to assembly areas near Luxembourg, a distance averaging 100 miles. The movement occurred on roads covered with ice and snow, under weather conditions that limited visibility and made driving treacherous. Convoys moved 24 hours daily, vehicles traveling in columns that stretched for miles, drivers navigating in darkness, using blackout lights that prevented German observation but made safe driving nearly impossible. Accidents were inevitable. Vehicles skidded off roads, collided with slower traffic, or broke down from mechanical stress. But Third Army's traffic control system, refined through months of operations, kept the movement flowing. Military police at intersections directed traffic, prioritizing units based on their role in upcoming operations. Recovery vehicles pulled disabled trucks and tanks off roads to clear lanes for following traffic. Units arrived at assembly areas, exhausted but intact, ready to attack on schedule. The logistical miracle that enabled Third Army's redeployment was the forward supply system Patton had created months earlier. Traditional logistics doctrine stockpiled supplies at depots in rear areas, requiring units to send trucks back to collect fuel, ammunition, and rations. This system created security and accountability but couldn't support the rapid movement Third Army was executing. Patton's system pre-positioned supplies along movement routes using intelligence about unit locations and planned movements. Fuel trucks waited at designated points where units would refuel during movement rather than after arrival. Ammunition trucks delivered loads to units in assembly areas rather than requiring units to send vehicles to distant depots. Rations moved forward continuously, ensuring soldiers ate during movement even if meal quality suffered. The system required junior officers making supply decisions, normally reserved for senior commanders, quartermasters, allocating resources based on radio updates rather than written orders, and accepting some waste and loss in exchange for speed. But it worked. Units arrived in assembly areas with fuel tanks full, ammunition loads complete, and soldiers fed, ready to attack immediately, rather than requiring days to prepare. December 22nd, 1944, 0600 hours. Third Corps attacked north toward Bastogne through a snowstorm that limited visibility to yards and turned roads into ice skating rinks. 4th Armoured Division led the advance, its combat commands attacking on separate axes toward the surrounded town. 3rd Infantry Division attacked on 4th Armoured's left flank, protecting against German counterattacks. 80th Infantry Division secured the Corps' right flank and followed the main advance. The German forces defending south of Bastogne, positioned to prevent relief of the encircled garrison, initially believed they faced reconnaissance elements or small task forces. When they realized they confronted an entire corps attacking with overwhelming force, German commanders radioed desperate requests for reinforcements and air support. But German resources were committed to the main offensive further north, leaving southern flank defenders to slow Third Corps with inadequate forces. The fighting during Third Corps' advance toward Bastogne combined Third Army's evolved combined arms capabilities with brutal winter conditions that challenged every assumption about operational possibility. Tank infantry teams advanced through snow-covered terrain where visibility prevented effective long-range fire, forcing engagements at point-blank range that favoured neither side consistently. Artillery provided continuous support despite weather that prevented aerial observation, firing missions directed by radio reports from forward observers who often couldn't see targets but estimated positions based on muzzle flashes and sound. Fighter bombers from 19th Tactical Air Command flew when weather permitted, attacking German positions and supply routes using techniques developed through months of cooperation with Third Army. The advance averaged 5 to 7 miles daily, slow by Third Army's August standards, but remarkable given winter conditions and German resistance. Each day brought Third Corps closer to Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division's garrison fought with depleting ammunition and surrounded by German forces. December 26, 1944, 16:45 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding 37th Tank Battalion of 4th Armoured Division, reported to Combat Command R headquarters that his lead tanks had made contact with elements of 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. The siege was broken. American forces had penetrated German encirclement and established a corridor through which supplies and reinforcements could reach the garrison. The relief had required exactly 96 hours, from Patton's promise at Verdun to Abrams' tanks entering Bastogne, a time frame that military historians would study for decades as an example of operational excellence. But Patton, receiving news of the relief at his headquarters, understood that breaking the siege was only the beginning. German forces still pressed on Bastogne from three sides. The corridor was narrow and vulnerable, and Third Army had to expand the relief operation into a sustained offensive that would eliminate the German Bulge entirely. German reaction to Third Army's arrival in the Ardennes revealed both the shock Third Army's speed had created and the German military's continued tactical competence. Intercepted radio messages showed German commanders expressing disbelief that Patton's forces could be in the Ardennes so quickly. Some German units received orders to prepare for Third Army attack days after Third Army had already engaged them, revealing how completely German intelligence had failed to track Third Army's movement. But once German forces recognized the threat, they responded with skill, redirecting forces from the offensive thrust to contain Third Army's advance and launching counterattacks against the Bastogne corridor. The fighting around Bastogne from late December through early January became some of the most intense Third Army experienced winter conditions, creating hardships that rivaled combat dangers, temperatures falling below 0 Fahrenheit, soldiers suffering frostbite at rates that exceeded combat casualties on some days, and supply difficulties that left units short of winter clothing and equipment. The human experience of Third Army soldiers during the Bulge revealed courage and endurance under conditions that tested physical and mental limits. Infantry soldiers fought in snow-covered forests where concealment favored defenders, where cold caused weapons to malfunction, and where evacuating wounded required carrying them on stretchers through terrain vehicles couldn't traverse. Tank crews operated vehicles where metal surfaces became so cold that bare skin touching them caused instant frostbite, where engines had to be started every few hours to prevent freezing, and where visibility through periscopes and vision slits was minimal. Artillery crews served guns in snow and ice, often working exposed to German counterfire because positions couldn't be properly dug in frozen ground. Supply truck drivers made runs through areas under German artillery fire, knowing that a single shell could destroy a truck and kill everyone aboard. Medics treated wounded in aid stations that lacked heat, performing surgeries in near-freezing temperatures, using instruments and supplies that froze, if not kept near body heat. The Bulge tested Third Army more severely than any previous operation, not through any single moment of crisis, but through sustained hardship that accumulated over weeks. The strategic impact of Third Army's intervention in the Bulge was decisive beyond the immediate tactical success of relieving Bastogne. German forces had committed their last significant operational reserve to the Ardennes offensive, gambling that surprise en masse could achieve a breakthrough that would force allies to negotiate rather than continuing offensive operations. Third Army's rapid response shortened the time available for German exploitation, forcing German commanders to commit forces to defend against Third Army rather than exploiting their initial penetration. The Bastogne relief specifically denied Germans a critical transportation hub, limiting their operational freedom and creating a salient that Third Army could attack from multiple directions. Most importantly, Third Army's performance validated Patton's operational methods and organizational innovations. The speed of movement, the combined arms effectiveness, and the ability to transition from one operational sector to another while maintaining offensive pressure demonstrated capabilities that justified Patton's earlier aggressive demands for resources. Eisenhower, watching Third Army's performance, gained renewed confidence in Patton's judgment and would give Third Army greater freedom and support for future operations. The impossible turn had succeeded, securing Bastogne, containing the German offensive, and positioning Third Army to transition from defense to attack as German forces exhausted themselves against expanded Allied resistance. January 3rd, 1945, Bastogne, Belgium. The besieged had become the besiegers. Third Corps, having broken through to relieve the 101st Airborne Division just 8 days earlier, now prepared to launch a counteroffensive that would transform the German salient from threat to trap. Major General John Milliken, Third Corps commander, stood in a cramped command post, studying maps that showed German positions surrounding Bastogne on 3 sides. German forces, having failed to capture the town during their offensive, now found themselves defending against an American army that had perfected the art of aggressive maneuver. Patton's orders were characteristically direct: attack north, cut the base of the German salient, trap German forces that had penetrated deepest into Allied lines, and destroy them. The plan was ambitious, requiring Third Army to attack in multiple directions simultaneously, while fighting in weather conditions that made movement difficult and visibility minimal. But Third Army had evolved beyond the exploitation force that raced across France. It had become an organisation capable of sustained offensive operations under the worst possible conditions. The hunters who had pursued Allied forces in retreat for 6 months were about to learn what pursuit felt like when roles reversed. The strategic situation in early January presented opportunities that German commanders recognised with growing desperation. The Ardennes offensive, launched with such confidence on December 16th, had failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. German forces hadn't reached the Meuse River, hadn't split Allied armies, and hadn't forced negotiated settlement. Instead, they had created a salient roughly 40 miles deep and 60 miles wide at its base, containing roughly 250,000 German soldiers in terrain where Allied air superiority could devastate them once weather cleared. Fuel shortages, which had plagued Third Army in September, now crippled German mobility. Panzers sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. Trucks that should have been moving supplies forward were abandoned when fuel ran out. German infantry, who had advanced enthusiastically during the offensive's first days, now dug defensive positions in frozen ground, knowing they faced counterattacks from fresh American divisions, while their own units were exhausted and undersupplied. German commanders requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions closer to the German border. Hitler, as he had done repeatedly throughout the war, refused to authorize retreat, insisting that every yard of ground be defended. Third Army's counteroffensive began with artillery bombardments that demonstrated how completely Third Army had mastered coordinated fire support. Over 800 artillery pieces, from lightweight pack howitzers to massive guns firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds, opened fire on German positions at dawn on January 3rd. The bombardment employed time-on-target techniques perfected during the Saar offensive, synchronized fire from multiple battalions, ensuring that shells arrived simultaneously without warning. German soldiers, sheltering in hastily dug positions that offered minimal protection, suffered casualties that intelligence officers would later estimate exceeded losses from the relief operation. The artillery preparation lasted 30 minutes, then shifted to rolling barrage that advanced progressively forward, suppressing German defenders as American infantry and armour attacked. The coordination required to execute this fire support, involving hundreds of guns firing thousands of rounds with timing measured in seconds, demonstrated organisational sophistication that few armies in history had achieved. The ground assault that followed the artillery preparation showcased Third Army's combined arms capabilities operating at peak efficiency despite brutal winter conditions. Tank infantry teams, advancing through snow that reached vehicle fenders in some areas, used tactics refined through months of combat. Tanks provided covering fire and mobility, while infantry cleared German positions that tanks couldn't assault directly. Combat engineers followed assault elements, clearing mines and obstacles to maintain momentum. Artillery forward observers, moving with leading units, called fires on German positions as they were identified, ensuring continuous fire support. The advance averaged 7 to 10 miles daily through terrain and weather that conventional military wisdom considered unsuitable for offensive operations. German defenders, fighting from disadvantageous positions without adequate supplies or reserves, conducted fighting withdrawals that bought time but couldn't prevent steady American advance. The air support that Third Army received, once weather cleared in mid-January, transformed the operational environment and sealed German forces' fate. 19th Tactical Air Command, which had supported Third Army since Normandy, launched massive strikes against German positions, supply routes, and reinforcements. Fighter bombers, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts carrying bombs and rockets, attacked in waves throughout daylight hours, destroying vehicles, artillery positions, and troop concentrations with devastating effectiveness. Medium bombers from 9th Air Force struck deeper targets, bridges that German forces needed for withdrawal, marshalling yards where German reinforcements gathered, and fuel dumps that supplied German operations. The intensity of air operations, over 12,000 sorties flown in support of Third Army during January, created conditions where German forces couldn't move during daylight without risking attack. Intercepted German radio messages revealed the psychological impact. commanders reporting that air attacks were causing more casualties than ground combat and that troop morale was collapsing under constant aerial bombardment. January 16th, 1945, Third Army and First Army forces linked up at Houffalize, Belgium, closing the gap and trapping German units that had retreated too slowly. The link-up occurred along roads littered with destroyed German equipment, abandoned vehicles, and evidence of the hasty retreat that German forces had conducted under Allied pressure. American soldiers advancing from south and north met in the ruins of a town that had changed hands multiple times during the battle, greeting each other with relief that the Bulge was finally being eliminated. But the link-up meant more than symbolic closure. It created a smaller pocket containing German rear guards and units that had been unable to withdraw, forces that Third Army would reduce over the following days through sustained pressure that prevented organized resistance. The German units trapped in the pocket, lacking supplies and reinforcements, surrendered in groups ranging from squads to battalions, often approaching American lines under white flags and reporting that their commanders had ordered them to fight to the last man, but that soldiers had decided surrender was preferable to pointless death. The material destruction Third Army inflicted on German forces during January exceeded losses from any previous month of the war. American forces destroyed or captured over 600 German tanks and assault guns, vehicles that Germany couldn't replace given the deteriorating industrial situation and Allied bombing campaign. Artillery pieces numbering over 1,400 were destroyed or captured, eliminating fire support that German forces desperately needed for defensive operations. Trucks, half-tracks, and other vehicles totaling over 6,500 were destroyed, crippling German mobility and supply capabilities. Small arms, crew-served weapons, and ammunition stockpiles fell into American hands in quantities that indicated how completely German supply planning had failed, but the most critical loss was personnel. Third Army captured over 37,000 German prisoners in January, including remnants of elite SS Panzer divisions that had spearheaded the December offensive. Estimates of German killed and wounded in Third Army's sector during January ranged from 40 to 50,000, casualties concentrated among experienced soldiers and junior officers whose loss would make future German resistance less effective. The human cost for Third Army soldiers during January was severe, but reflected the intensity of operations rather than operational failure. American casualties during the month totaled approximately 23,000, killed, wounded, and missing losses distributed across units that had been fighting continuously since late December. Infantry rifle companies, which bore the primary burden of close combat, suffered casualties that left some units at half strength or less. The replacement system, struggling to provide soldiers as quickly as units lost them, sent increasingly young and poorly trained replacements to frontline units. 18-year-old privates with minimal training joined veteran units and went into combat within hours, often dying before learning basic survival skills that veterans took for granted. Non-combat casualties from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure rivaled combat losses during some periods, reflecting the brutal winter conditions and inadequate winter clothing that plagued American forces throughout the Bulge campaign. January 22nd, 1945, Third Army forces reached positions they had occupied on December 15th, before the German offensive began, having recaptured all ground lost during the German attack and advanced roughly 20 miles beyond into German territory. The achievement represented complete reversal of German offensive gains and positioning of Allied forces for resumed offensive operations toward the Rhine River and German heartland. Patton, visiting forward units near the German border, spoke to soldiers who had fought continuously for over a month in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. He thanked them for their service, promised them that their sacrifices had achieved decisive results, and told them the war would soon be over. The last prediction was optimistic. Combat would continue for over 3 more months, but the Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point beyond its immediate tactical results. German forces had committed their last operational reserve and failed. They had attacked under favourable conditions, achieving surprise and local superiority, yet been defeated by Allied response that combined strategic depth with operational flexibility. Third Army's role in that response, from Patton's 48-hour promise to the sustained offensive that eliminated the Bulge, had validated everything Patton believed about mobile warfare and aggressive leadership. The strategic consequences of the Bulge extended beyond the immediate battlefield to affect the entire course of the war's final months. Germany had lost approximately 120,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured during the offensive, casualties that couldn't be replaced from Germany's depleting manpower pool. Equipment losses, particularly in tanks and vehicles, exhausted reserves that German industry couldn't replenish given Allied bombing and Soviet advances in the east. Most critically, Germany had lost time and operational freedom. The resources committed to the Ardennes offensive could have strengthened defences along the Rhine or reinforced the Eastern Front where Soviet forces were preparing massive winter offensives. Instead, those resources had been squandered in an offensive that achieved nothing except accelerating Germany's collapse. For Third Army specifically, the Bulge validated organisational innovations and tactical methods developed through months of combat. The combined arms integration, artillery coordination, air-ground cooperation, and logistical flexibility that Third Army demonstrated during the battle became standard practices that would guide American military doctrine for decades. The army that had raced across France, struggled in Lorraine, and evolved through hard lessons had become the most effective fighting force in the European theatre. The aftermath of the Bulge found Third Army in a position both advantageous and challenging. Advantageous because German forces were demonstrably broken, unable to conduct major offensive operations, and struggling to defend against sustained Allied pressure. Challenging because the victories of late December and January had exhausted Third Army's soldiers, worn out equipment, and consumed supplies at rates that logistics struggled to sustain. Infantry divisions that had fought continuously since late December needed rest, and refitting that operational tempo couldn't provide. Tank battalions needed to replace worn-out vehicles and train new crews to replace casualties. Artillery units needed to rebuild ammunition stocks depleted during weeks of intensive fire support, but Patton, recognizing that German weakness created opportunities that delay would squander, pushed for immediate resumption of offensive operations. The debate at higher headquarters wasn't whether to attack, but how quickly Allied forces could transition from defensive victory in the Bulge to renewed offensive toward Germany's heartland. Third Army, having proved it could respond to crisis and execute complex operations under terrible conditions, would lead that offensive and demonstrate that the lessons learned across 8 months of combat had created an army capable of ending the war in Europe. March 1st, 1945, Trier, Germany, an ancient Roman city on the Moselle River, site of imperial monuments that had stood for nearly 2,000 years. Now it was a fortress defended by German forces determined to prevent Third Army from crossing the Moselle and advancing into the German interior. 10th Armoured Division, attacking from the west, faced German defenders who had turned every building into a strong point and every street into a killing zone. Major General William Morris, the division commander, had promised Patton he would capture Trier within 48 hours. The promise seemed reckless, given German defensive strength, but Morris understood something that German defenders didn't. Third Army had evolved beyond the force that struggled at Metz in autumn. The tactics, the coordination, the aggressive execution that Third Army brought to Trier represented 8 months of continuous evolution under combat pressure. The assault began with time-on-target artillery bombardment that collapsed buildings and stunned defenders. Tank infantry teams penetrated the city's outskirts using tactics perfected through dozens of similar assaults. Combat engineers cleared obstacles and reduced strong points with efficiency that reflected hard-won experience. By March 3rd, just 48 hours after the assault began, 10th Armoured controlled Trier and was preparing to cross the Moselle. Morris had kept his promise. More importantly, the rapid capture signalled that Third Army had become unstoppable. The strategic situation in early March 1945 offered Third Army opportunities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. German forces defending the Saar-Palatinate region, the triangle of territory between the Moselle River, the Rhine River, and the German border, numbered approximately 80,000 soldiers from 14 divisions. But these divisions bore little resemblance to the powerful formations Germany had fielded earlier in the war. Most were under strength, fielding 2,000 soldiers instead of the 15,000 a full-strength division should have. Many consisted of hastily assembled replacements, teenagers, and old men with minimal training, fighting alongside veterans exhausted by years of combat. Equipment was inadequate. Divisions that should have fielded hundreds of artillery pieces operating with dozens, tank battalions with a handful of operational panzers instead of the 100+ they needed. German commanders recognized their weakness but lacked authority to conduct the strategic withdrawal that might preserve their forces. Hitler's standing orders prohibited retreat, demanding that every German city and town be defended regardless of military logic. Patton's operational plan for the Saar-Palatinate offensive demonstrated strategic sophistication that complemented his tactical aggression. Rather than conducting a frontal assault that would allow German forces to retreat gradually while conducting fighting withdrawals, Patton designed a double envelopment that would trap German forces in a pocket and force their surrender or destruction. 20th Corps would attack east from the Saar River toward Kaiserslautern, forming the southern pincer. 12th Corps would drive southeast from positions north of the Moselle, forming the northern pincer. If executed properly, the two corps would meet east of the German defensive positions, cutting off retreat routes to the Rhine and trapping the bulk of German forces in the Saar-Palatinate triangle. The plan required precise coordination between corps operating 50 miles apart, rapid advance to close the trap before Germans could escape, and acceptance of risk inherent in deep penetrations that created exposed flanks. But Patton, confident in his commanders and organisation, believed Third Army could execute the operation with acceptable casualties and decisive results. March 13, 1945, the offensive began. 12th and 20th Corps attacked simultaneously, using tactics and procedures that had become standard Third Army practice. Artillery preparation suppressed German defensive positions. Fighter bombers from 19th Tactical Air Command struck German rear areas, disrupting reinforcement and supply. Tank infantry teams led the assault, exploiting gaps in German defences and bypassing strong points that could be reduced by follow-on forces. The advance achieved immediate success that exceeded even optimistic planning assumptions. German resistance, while locally determined in some sectors, lacked the coordination and depth that had characterized earlier defensive operations. Units that attempted to establish defensive lines discovered American forces already in their rear, forcing hasty retreats that often became routes. Within 48 hours, both corps had penetrated beyond the initial German defensive positions and were exploiting into the German rear with minimal organised opposition. The operational tempo Third Army achieved during mid-March recalled the August 1944 exploitation across France, but with critical differences that made the March advance more impressive. In August, Third Army had faced disorganised German forces retreating in chaos after Normandy's collapse. In March, Third Army faced German forces defending home territory with clear orders to resist. Yet, Third Army advanced faster in March than it had in August, covering 140 miles in 14 days versus 400 miles in 30 days during the earlier operation. The improved performance reflected organisational maturity and tactical proficiency that months of combat had developed. Units knew how to bypass resistance efficiently, calling in airstrikes or artillery while continuing movement rather than becoming fixed in combat. Supply systems operated with efficiency that kept fuel and ammunition flowing to advancing units without the bottlenecks that had constrained August operations. Communications networks enabled corps commanders to adjust operations in real time based on developing situations rather than waiting for scheduled reports and updates. March 20th through 25th, the pocket closed. 20th Corps advancing east met 12th Corps driving southeast near Ludwigshafen, trapping approximately 70,000 German soldiers in a shrinking perimeter. German commanders, recognizing encirclement, requested permission to withdraw forces to the Rhine before the trap sealed completely. Hitler, maintaining his refusal to authorize retreats, ordered the surrounded forces to fight where they stood and promised reinforcements that didn't exist. German soldiers, facing the choice between pointless resistance and surrender, increasingly chose the latter. Units that attempted to break out encountered American blocking positions and were destroyed or forced back into the shrinking pocket. Units that remained in place found themselves subjected to continuous artillery bombardment and air attack that made sustained resistance impossible. By March 25th, organised resistance within the pocket had collapsed. Third Army captured over 75,000 prisoners, destroyed or captured hundreds of artillery pieces and vehicles, and eliminated 12 German divisions as effective fighting forces. March 22nd, 1945, 2200 hours. While 12th and 20th Corps were closing the Saar-Palatinate pocket, 5th Infantry Division was executing an operation that would achieve strategic surprise and validate Patton's willingness to take operational risks. Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin, 5th Division Commander, received orders from Patton to cross the Rhine River at Oppenheim, 20 miles south of Mainz, using assault boats, and without the elaborate preparation that conventional military wisdom prescribed for river crossings. The operation was classic, aggressive, risky, and designed to exploit German weakness before it could be corrected. 5th Division assembled assault boats in secret, moved infantry battalions to crossing sites under cover of darkness, and launched the crossing at 2200 hours with minimal artillery preparation that might alert German defenders. German forces guarding the Rhine at Oppenheim were minimal rear echelon troops who hadn't expected an assault at that location and who were unprepared to repel a determined crossing. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim succeeded beyond Patton's optimistic expectations. 5th Division's lead battalions crossed the river in assault boats, established a small bridgehead on the eastern bank, and repelled disorganized German counterattacks. By dawn on March 23rd, over 2,000 American soldiers occupied positions on the east bank of the Rhine, Germany's last significant natural barrier to invasion. Engineers began constructing a pontoon bridge that would allow vehicles and heavy equipment to cross. Within 18 hours, the bridge was complete and tanks were crossing into the bridgehead. Within 36 hours, the entire division had crossed and was expanding the bridgehead against increasing but still disorganized German resistance. Patton, visiting the bridgehead on March 24th, famously urinated in the Rhine River, a symbolic gesture that received extensive press coverage and reinforced his public image as an aggressive commander who showed contempt for German resistance. The strategic significance of the Oppenheim crossing extended beyond the immediate tactical achievement. Third Army had crossed the Rhine one day before Montgomery's Operation Plunder, the massive British crossing north of the Ruhr that involved weeks of preparation, over 30,000 troops in the initial assault, and extensive air support, including airborne drops. Patton's crossing used a single division, minimal preparation, and achieved complete surprise. The comparison embarrassed Montgomery and frustrated Eisenhower, who had allocated substantial resources to support Montgomery's operation, while Third Army crossed with locally available assets. But beyond command politics, the Oppenheim crossing demonstrated that German defences along the Rhine were weak, that aggressive action could achieve results that cautious preparation couldn't match, and that Third Army had developed capabilities that made it the most effective offensive force in the European theatre. The Saar-Palatinate campaign's results validated every aspect of Third Army's operational doctrine and organisational design. In 12 days of operations, Third Army had advanced 140 miles, captured over 113,000 German prisoners, destroyed or captured thousands of German vehicles and artillery pieces, and eliminated 14 German divisions while suffering fewer than 6,000 casualties. The casualty ratio, roughly 19 German casualties for every American casualty, reflected operational excellence that combined aggressive maneuver with effective fire support and air-ground coordination. The speed of advance demonstrated that Third Army could operate at August's exploitation tempo even against defending German forces on home territory. The Rhine crossing proved that Third Army could execute complex operations with minimal preparation when leadership was willing to accept risk and soldiers were trained to standards that enabled rapid execution. The captured Saar industrial region represented economic victory that complemented military success. Third Army occupied coal mines that had produced millions of tons annually for German war industry, manufacturing facilities that had built weapons and vehicles, and transportation networks that had moved raw materials and finished products. The region's capture deprived Germany of resources that couldn't be replaced from remaining controlled territory. Intelligence officers surveying captured facilities reported that German industrial output had already declined dramatically due to Allied bombing and raw material shortages, but the Saar's loss ensured that Germany couldn't recover production even if bombing ceased. The strategic impact was profound. Germany's ability to sustain military operations was degrading faster than battlefield losses alone could explain economic collapse, paralleling military defeat. March 25th, 1945. Patton stood on the east bank of the Rhine, watching his divisions cross pontoon bridges and disperse into Germany's interior. Behind him lay 8 months of operations that had transformed Third Army from phantom organisation to victorious force. Ahead lay Germany's heartland, increasingly defended by units that existed more on paper than in reality, protected by leaders who refused to accept inevitable defeat. Patton understood that the war was effectively over, that German military capability had collapsed beyond recovery, and that remaining operations would be pursuit and occupation rather than contested battles. But he also understood that Pursuit required aggressive execution to minimize the time available for German resistance to organize and to reduce the casualties that even defeated enemies could inflict. Third Army would maintain its operational tempo, advancing as rapidly as supplies and German resistance permitted until final victory was achieved. The Saar-Palatinate campaign had proved that Third Army, the organization assembled in secret while Patton commanded Phantoms, trained through summer of 1944, tested in Normandy, educated in Lorraine, refined through the Bulge, had become the instrument of German defeat in the West. The final drive was beginning. March 28, 1945, Main River, Germany. 4th Armoured Division's tanks rolled across newly constructed pontoon bridges, moving deeper into Germany than any Allied force had yet reached. Combat Command B, leading the division's advance, consisted of Sherman tanks blackened by months of combat, their crews veterans who had fought from Normandy through the Bulge and across the Rhine. The advance faced minimal resistance. German forces that should have defended the main river crossing had already retreated or dissolved into civilian populations. Villages surrendered without fight, white flags hanging from windows as American columns passed through streets, where days earlier German officials had promised that no enemy would ever set foot on German soil. The speed of advance averaged 30 miles daily, faster than sustained operations in France, faster than the pursuit after the Bulge, faster than any advance in modern military history, except the initial German blitzkrieg through France in 1940. But this wasn't exploitation of a broken defensive line. This was pursuit of an enemy whose military organization was collapsing faster than battlefield defeats could explain. Third Army was witnessing the death of the Third Reich in real time, advancing through a nation whose government refused to surrender, but whose soldiers increasingly refused to fight. The strategic situation in late March revealed contradictions that defined Germany's final weeks. The German government relocated to increasingly scattered facilities as Allied forces approached Berlin from east and west, continued issuing orders for total resistance. Hitler, directing operations from his bunker in Berlin, demanded that every German city be defended to the last soldier, that retreats be punished as treason, and that wonder weapons would soon turn the tide of war. SS units, the fanatic core of Nazi military power, enforced these orders through summary executions of soldiers who showed defeatism or commanders who retreated without authorization. Yet simultaneously, German military organization was dissolving. Units ordered to defend specific positions discovered that neighboring units had already withdrawn, leaving flanks exposed. Supply systems that should have delivered fuel, ammunition, and rations delivered nothing. Trucks and trains unable to operate under constant Allied air attack. Communications networks degraded as facilities were destroyed and personnel deserted. Junior officers and NCOs, recognizing that continued resistance was pointless, increasingly made independent decisions to surrender or withdraw regardless of orders. April 4th, 1945. Third Army soldiers made a discovery that transformed their understanding of the war they'd been fighting. 12th Corps units, advancing through central Germany, entered Ohrdruf, a small town that appeared unremarkable until soldiers discovered a concentration camp on its outskirts. The camp had been evacuated days earlier, SS guards forcing prisoners on death marches toward other facilities, but evidence of atrocities remained. Soldiers found bodies stacked in crude mass graves, survivors too weak to walk during evacuation, abandoned to die, and facilities designed for systematic murder. Medical officers examining survivors diagnosed starvation, disease, and injuries from beatings and torture. Intelligence officers reviewing camp documents discovered it was a subcamp of Buchenwald, part of a network that imprisoned and murdered millions. Patton, visiting Ohrdruf on April 12th, ordered his soldiers to tour the camp, wanting them to witness the evil they'd been fighting. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton walked through the facilities together, confronting evidence that validated the war's moral necessity beyond any strategic calculation. The liberation of concentration camps became a recurring and traumatic experience for Third Army soldiers through April and early May. Buchenwald, liberated by Third Corps on April 11th, held over 20,000 prisoners in conditions that shocked even combat-hardened soldiers. Mauthausen, liberated by 11th Armoured Division on May 5th, revealed evidence of murder on industrial scale, gas chambers and crematoria that had processed thousands of victims. Third Army soldiers, many of whom had questioned why they were fighting a war in Europe when Japan had attacked America, gained visceral understanding of Nazi evil that no propaganda could have communicated. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had treated captured German soldiers with basic respect now struggled to maintain professional conduct. Some units, discovering camps and witnessing conditions prisoners endured, committed reprisal killings against SS guards, executing men who had surrendered rather than following proper prisoner handling procedures. Patton, while officially condemning such actions, privately expressed understanding and ordered minimal investigations. The operational tempo Third Army maintained through April created statistics that strained credibility but were verified through daily situation reports and captured German records. April 14th, 1945. Third Army units captured over 50 cities and towns in a single day, advancing on multiple axes with corps operating nearly independently. 4th Armoured Division alone covered 60 miles in 24 hours, a pace that exceeded German advances during the fall of France. 11th Armoured Division reached the Austrian border on April 26th, having advanced over 300 miles in 3 weeks. 3rd Infantry Division captured Nuremberg after 3 days of fighting, securing a city of enormous symbolic importance that Nazi propaganda had declared would never fall. The advances occurred despite token German resistance, bypassed units that chose to defend, and minimal Allied casualties. Third Army was demonstrating that a modern mechanized army, properly organized and led aggressively, could sustain operational tempo that made defense nearly impossible, even when defenders had clear orders to resist. April 26, 1945, 11th Armoured Division crossed from Germany into Austria, becoming the first American forces to enter Hitler's homeland. The advance through Austria encountered resistance that varied wildly between fanatical SS units that fought to annihilation and German army units that surrendered at first opportunity. Austrian civilians, many of whom considered themselves victims of German annexation in 1938, greeted American forces with ambiguous mixture of relief and apprehension. Towns displayed both Nazi flags and hastily produced Austrian flags. Residents, unable to predict which would prove safer when American forces arrived. Third Army intelligence officers, interrogating prisoners and interviewing civilians, gathered evidence that Nazi leadership planned to establish a national redoubt in the Alps, a fortified region where SS units and fanatical defenders would continue resistance even after Germany proper fell. The intelligence proved exaggerated. The redoubt existed more in Nazi propaganda than reality, but the threat justified. Third Army's rapid advance through Austria to occupy potential defensive positions before German forces could organize coherent resistance. The supply system that sustained Third Army's April advances operated at levels that pre-war planning had considered impossible. Red Ball Express principles, refined through 8 months of operations, moved supplies forward at pace that matched combat advance. Trucks traveled continuously, drivers operating in shifts to maintain 24-hour operations, convoys stretching across hundreds of miles from rear depots to forward units. Fuel consumption reached over 500,000 gallons daily when all Third Army units operated at maximum tempo, exceeding even August 1944 consumption rates. Ammunition expenditure was lower than during breakthrough battles, German resistance being too disorganized to require intensive fire support, but remained substantial enough to require continuous resupply. Food distribution maintained basic nutrition but sacrificed variety and quality, soldiers eating monotonous rations that provided calories but little satisfaction. The system worked because everyone involved understood that speed mattered more than comfort, that rapid advance saved American lives by preventing Germans from organizing resistance, and that the war's end was close enough to make temporary hardships acceptable. May 5th, 1945, Third Army units reached positions along the Czech border, having advanced over 450 miles from the Rhine in 6 weeks. The advance had liberated millions of civilians in Germany and Austria, captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and occupied territory equivalent to a medium-sized European nation. But Third Army's furthest advance, which placed units within 40 miles of Prague, was halted by political decision rather than German resistance. The Allied agreement with Soviet forces prescribed boundaries between American Soviet occupation zones in Czechoslovakia. Prague fell within the designated Soviet zone. Eisenhower, committed to maintaining Allied cooperation with Stalin despite growing tensions, ordered Third Army to halt at the agreed boundary and allow Soviet forces to liberate Prague. Patton, furious at the order, argued that Third Army could easily reach Prague before Soviet forces, and that allowing Soviets to occupy Czechoslovakia would create post-war problems. Eisenhower overruled him, prioritizing coalition politics over tactical opportunism. The halt order on the Czech border represented frustration for soldiers who had fought across Europe and now stood ready to liberate another capital city. Tank crews sat in their Shermans watching Prague through binoculars, knowing they could reach the city within hours if permitted. Infantry soldiers established defensive positions along the designated boundary, facing east towards Soviet forces rather than west toward retreating Germans. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. Third Army had spent 8 months advancing against German resistance. Now it sat idle while political authorities decided occupation boundaries and spheres of influence. The waiting period, which lasted until Soviet forces reached Prague on May 9th, created tension between American and Soviet forces that would characterize post-war relations. American units observed Soviet military operations and equipment, assessing capabilities that might become relevant if the wartime alliance collapsed into peacetime rivalry. May 7th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, effective May 8th. The news reached Third Army units through radio broadcasts and official announcements from headquarters. Soldiers celebrated with mixture of joy and exhaustion, happy the fighting had ended but too tired for extended revelry. 8 months of continuous combat, from Normandy through the Bulge, through Germany and Austria, had worn down even the youngest and most enthusiastic soldiers. Victory meant different things to different people. For combat veterans who had survived since D-Day, it meant they might finally go home. For replacement soldiers who had joined units in recent weeks, it meant they had survived without being killed in what would have been a pointless final battle. For commanders and staff officers, it meant transition from combat operations to occupation duties that would bring different challenges. Patton, speaking to Third Army division commanders on May 9th, praised their achievements and warned that peace would bring political complications that might prove more difficult than combat had been. The statistics Third Army compiled at war's end told a story of unprecedented operational success. From August 1st, 1944, activation, through May 8th, 1945, surrender. Third Army had advanced over 700 miles from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. It had liberated or captured over 81,000 square miles of territory in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Third Army had captured over 956,000 German prisoners, killed or wounded an estimated 500,000 Germans, and destroyed thousands of German tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces. These achievements came at cost of approximately 137,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, a casualty ratio that favoured Third Army roughly 4-1 against German forces. The statistics validated Patton's aggressive operational methods, demonstrated that mobile warfare could achieve decisive results at acceptable cost, and established Third Army as one of the most effective combat organizations in modern military history. The human achievement behind statistics was Third Army soldiers who had endured 8 months of continuous operations under conditions ranging from summer heat in France to winter freeze in Belgium to spring mud in Germany. Over 500,000 soldiers had served in Third Army during its active operations, from division commanders to supply truck drivers, from tank crews to medical personnel, from infantry riflemen to quartermaster clerks. They had overcome challenges that pre-war planning hadn't anticipated, solved problems that doctrine didn't address, and achieved results that skeptics had considered impossible. Third Army's victory wasn't solely Patton's achievement, though his leadership was critical. It was the collective accomplishment of an organization that had learnt, adapted, and continuously improved under combat pressure. The army that began as phantom deception in Britain had become the spearhead that helped end the war in Europe. The soldiers who had wondered if they would survive to see victory now faced the future, knowing they had contributed to one of history's most decisive military campaigns. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. While celebrations erupted across America and Britain, Third Army soldiers in Austria and Czechoslovakia experienced muted relief mixed with uncertainty. The shooting had stopped, but the future remained unclear. Patton gathered his staff at headquarters and delivered a characteristically blunt assessment: "We've conquered the wrong enemy." His officers understood the implications. Soviet forces, advancing from the east, now occupied positions throughout Central Europe. The wartime alliance that had defeated Germany was already showing strains that would define the post-war world. Within hours of Germany's surrender, Third Army units began receiving reports of contact with Soviet forces along the occupation zone boundaries. The meetings were officially friendly, Allied commanders exchanging congratulations and toasts to shared victory. But beneath diplomatic courtesies ran currents of suspicion and competition that foreshadowed the Cold War. Third Army, having spent 8 months fighting Germans, now faced the prospect of occupying territory adjacent to a former ally whose long-term intentions remained uncertain. May 9th, 1945, Linz, Austria. The first formal meeting between Third Army and Soviet forces. Major General Stanley Reinhardt, commanding 65th Infantry Division, met with Soviet General Alexei Antonov at a ceremony orchestrated to demonstrate Allied unity for press photographers and newsreel cameras. American and Soviet soldiers shook hands, exchanged cigarettes and small gifts, and posed for photographs that would appear in newspapers worldwide as evidence of continuing cooperation. But away from cameras, the atmosphere was tense. Soviet officers observed American equipment and organization with professional interest that suggested military assessment rather than friendly curiosity. American officers noticed that Soviet units appeared larger than intelligence estimates had indicated, and that Soviet soldiers were strictly controlled by political officers who monitored all interactions with Americans. Intelligence officers from both sides attended the ceremonies while mentally cataloguing everything they observed about the other's capabilities, organization, and readiness. The Soviet military presence that Third Army encountered along occupation boundaries was massive and impressive in ways that surprised even experienced American commanders. Soviet forces in Austria and Czechoslovakia numbered over 2 million soldiers, roughly 4 times Third Army's strength. Organized in armies that dwarfed American organizational structures, Soviet equipment, while generally considered inferior to American in quality, was present in quantities that American commanders found shocking. Tank parks held hundreds of 34 medium tanks and heavy Joseph Stalin tanks that appeared technically crude but operationally effective. Artillery concentrations included thousands of guns, ranging from light field pieces to massive siege weapons. Supply depots held stockpiles that suggested Soviet forces had logistical depth far beyond what American intelligence had estimated. American officers touring Soviet positions with official approval reported that Soviet military organization emphasized mass over sophistication, accepting lower individual soldier training and equipment quality in exchange for overwhelming numerical superiority. The displaced persons crisis that Third Army inherited with Germany's surrender created humanitarian challenges that dwarfed any military operation the organization had conducted. Over 2 million displaced persons, DPs in military shorthand, occupied Third Army's zone of control in southern Germany and Austria. These DPs included former slave laborers brought from across Europe to work in German factories, concentration camp survivors too ill or weak to return home immediately, prisoners of war from multiple nations awaiting repatriation, and ethnic Germans expelled from territories that would become part of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Third Army, designed as combat organization, suddenly became responsible for feeding, housing, and providing medical care to civilian population larger than most American cities. Supply officers who had moved ammunition and fuel now requisitioned food and medicine. Military police who had directed combat traffic now maintained order in DP camps. Medical personnel who had treated combat casualties now addressed malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma among civilians. The forced repatriation of Soviet citizens became one of Third Army's most morally troubling occupation duties. Allied agreements with Stalin required that Soviet citizens found in Western occupation zones be returned to Soviet control, regardless of individual wishes. This policy seemed straightforward when it involved returning Soviet prisoners of war who wanted to go home, but it created ethical catastrophes when applied to Soviet citizens who fled west to avoid Stalin's regime, former Red Army soldiers who had been captured and then volunteered for German service rather than die in POW camps, and civilians from Soviet-annexed territories who considered themselves Polish, Ukrainian, or Baltic rather than Soviet. Third Army units ordered to transfer these people to Soviet custody witnessed Soviet reception procedures that suggested returnees faced imprisonment or execution rather than reintegration. Patton, receiving reports from subordinate commanders troubled by forced repatriation operations, protested to higher headquarters that American forces shouldn't participate in what appeared to be delivering victims to executioners. Eisenhower, constrained by political agreements and Allied unity requirements, overruled Patton and ordered compliance with repatriation agreements. May 20th, 1945, Patton conducted a personal inspection tour of Soviet-occupied territory in eastern Austria, travelling with small staff and Soviet liaison officers who carefully controlled what he could observe. The tour reinforced Patton's growing conviction that Soviet forces represented potential threat rather than continued ally. He observed Soviet soldiers living in conditions that American forces would consider unacceptable, sleeping in commandeered buildings without proper sanitation, eating rations that lacked variety or adequate nutrition, and wearing uniforms that showed signs of long use without replacement. But he also observed discipline and organization that suggested Soviet forces could sustain operations despite hardships that would incapacitate American units. Soviet officers, when Patton engaged them in conversation through interpreters, expressed confidence that Soviet military power would dominate post-war Europe and that American forces would soon withdraw to leave the continent under Soviet influence. Patton returned from the tour convinced that maintaining strong American military presence in Europe was essential to preventing Soviet expansion. The assessment Third Army intelligence officers compiled about Soviet capabilities and intentions became a foundational document for early Cold War military planning. The report, classified and distributed only to senior headquarters, evaluated Soviet strengths and weaknesses based on observations from May through July 1945. Strengths included numerical superiority across all categories, willingness to accept casualties that American political culture wouldn't tolerate, extensive combat experience from years of Eastern Front fighting and leadership that made decisions based on military logic rather than political constraints. Weaknesses included inferior equipment quality compared to American standards, rigid tactical doctrine that emphasized mass over maneuver, logistics systems that depended on living off occupied territory rather than organized supply networks, and morale that depended on political control rather than unit cohesion. The report concluded that Soviet forces could defeat American forces through numerical superiority if conflict occurred in Central Europe, but that American technological advantages and supply capabilities would prove decisive in extended conflict. June 7th, 1945. Patton delivered a speech to 3rd Armored Division that created controversy reaching to Washington and contributed to his eventual relief from command. Speaking to soldiers gathered for awards ceremony, Patton warned that peace might not last, that Soviet intentions appeared hostile, and that Third Army might need to fight Soviets sooner rather than later. The speech, made without coordination with higher headquarters and reflecting Patton's personal views rather than official policy, violated diplomatic protocols that prescribed public expressions of Allied unity. Reporters present at the ceremony filed stories that quoted Patton's remarks, creating headlines suggesting senior American commander advocated war with Soviets. Eisenhower, receiving complaints from State Department and Soviet authorities, ordered Patton to issue a clarifying statement and lectured him about the importance of maintaining Allied relations during transition to peacetime. Patton, in his diary, wrote that he had told soldiers truth and that political considerations shouldn't prevent honest assessment of strategic situation. The cultural clash between American and Soviet forces along occupation boundaries created daily incidents that tested both military discipline and diplomatic patience. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to taking whatever they wanted from civilian populations, continued these practices in occupied Austria, requisitioning property, demanding services, and occasionally committing crimes against civilians. American forces, operating under stricter legal frameworks and cultural norms, tried to prevent Soviet abuses in American-occupied areas while maintaining officially correct relations with Soviet commands. Soviet authorities accused Americans of harboring war criminals and collaborators who should be transferred to Soviet justice. American authorities accused Soviets of kidnapping refugees from DP camps and forcing repatriation through violence. The accusations, while based on legitimate grievances, created atmosphere of suspicion that made routine coordination difficult and suggested that the wartime alliance was fragmenting under pressures that victory had previously masked. The long-term significance of Third Army's encounter with Soviet forces was the role those observations played in shaping American Cold War strategy. Officers who served in Third Army during May through August 1945, experiencing first-hand contact with Soviet military power and witnessing Soviet occupation policies, carried those experiences into post-war assignments that would shape American defense policy for decades. They understood that Soviet forces were formidable but not invincible, that Soviet intentions appeared expansionist but could be contained through strength, and that American military presence in Europe was necessary to prevent Soviet domination of the continent. These conclusions, drawn from direct observation rather than ideological assumptions, provided practical foundation for containment strategy that would define American foreign policy through the Cold War. Third Army's contribution to Cold War planning wasn't deliberate strategy, but accumulated knowledge from soldiers who had defeated one totalitarian power and now faced the prospect of confronting another. The transition from wartime alliance to peacetime rivalry occurred gradually through summer 1945, but was evident to Third Army soldiers who witnessed the change daily. Initial meetings between American and Soviet forces featured genuine celebration of shared victory and mutual respect between soldiers who had fought common enemy. But as weeks passed and occupation duties replaced combat operations, the celebrations gave way to routine interactions that revealed fundamental differences in values, methods, and objectives. Soviet forces appeared increasingly interested in permanent occupation and political control of territory they held. American forces, following instructions from Washington, prepared to maintain occupation temporarily until stable governments could be established and Allied agreements implemented. The diverging objectives created friction that no amount of diplomatic courtesy could eliminate. By late summer, the optimism that had characterized early meetings had been replaced by wary coexistence between forces that had been allies but might become adversaries. August 15th, 1945, victory over Japan Day. Germany's surrender in May had left the war in the Pacific continuing, creating uncertainty for Third Army soldiers about whether they would deploy to Asia or remain in Europe. The Japanese surrender, achieved through combination of Soviet entry into Pacific War and American atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ended that uncertainty. Third Army would not redeploy to Pacific. Soldiers who had fought from Normandy through Germany could begin contemplating return to civilian life rather than continued combat on different continents. The relief was profound. Third Army had suffered 137,000 casualties defeating Germany. Redeployment to Pacific would have meant starting the process again against enemy whose fanatical resistance had made every island campaign a bloodbath. The Japanese surrender meant Third Army's war was truly over, that occupation duties would transition eventually to demobilization, and that soldiers who had survived could reasonably hope to go home. But it also meant transition from wartime unity of purpose to peacetime uncertainty about future roles, missions, and the question of what army would look like when soldiers who wanted only to return home were replaced by peacetime volunteers. June 1st, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. Third Army's area of responsibility transformed from combat zone to occupied territory encompassing 16 million German civilians. Patton, appointed military governor of Bavaria, in addition to his duties as Third Army commander, inherited responsibilities that bore no resemblance to combat command. Instead of planning offensive operations, he now oversaw civilian administration. Instead of destroying enemy forces, he managed denazification programs designed to remove former Nazi Party members from positions of authority. Instead of advancing toward military objectives, he maintained order among populations that included German civilians, displaced persons, and occupation troops whose relationship with each other ranged from cooperation to hostility. The transition from warrior to administrator suited neither Patton's temperament nor his skills. He understood combat, aggression, and decisive action. He struggled with bureaucracy, political complexity, and the ambiguity that characterized occupation duties. The struggle would ultimately cost him his command and contribute to his death. The denazification program that Third Army was ordered to implement reflected Allied determination to prevent future German militarism, but created practical problems that frustrated military governors trying to maintain basic civil functions. The program required removing from public employment anyone who had been Nazi Party member, held position in Nazi organizations, or supported the regime in ways that could be documented. In theory, this policy would eliminate Nazi influence from German society. In practice, it created chaos. Germany's civil service, education system, and essential services had been thoroughly penetrated by Nazi Party membership requirements. Teachers couldn't teach in public schools without party membership. Engineers couldn't work on infrastructure projects without party affiliation. Doctors couldn't practice in public hospitals without demonstrated loyalty to the regime. Removing all former party members from employment meant eliminating most qualified personnel available to maintain basic services that occupation forces needed to function. Patton's response to denazification requirements created the controversy that would end his command of Third Army. He argued, publicly and repeatedly, that not all former Nazi Party members were equally guilty and that occupation authorities needed to distinguish between party leadership who committed or enabled atrocities and ordinary Germans who joined the party because professional advancement required it. He compared Nazi Party membership in Germany to Republican or Democratic Party membership in America, suggesting that party affiliation didn't necessarily reflect ideological commitment. The comparison, reported by press and transmitted to Washington, created scandal. American public opinion, shaped by newsreel footage of concentration camps and reports of Nazi atrocities, would not accept nuanced distinctions about party membership. Political pressure demanded that occupation authorities implement denazification aggressively, regardless of practical consequences. Eisenhower, receiving complaints from Washington about Patton's statements, ordered Patton to comply with denazification directives without public complaint. The black market that flourished in occupied Germany created another challenge that military government struggled to address. German civilian economy had collapsed, official currency was nearly worthless, and basic goods were scarce to non-existent through legal channels. Black markets filled the gap, trading cigarettes as currency and offering everything from food to luxury goods to sexual services in exchange for items that occupation forces possessed in abundance. American soldiers, many of whom had minimal money but access to supplies, participated in black market trading that military law prohibited but that military police couldn't effectively prevent. The trading ranged from relatively innocent exchanges, soldiers trading chocolate or cigarettes for souvenirs, to criminal enterprises involving theft of military supplies for sale to German civilians. Patton, receiving reports of black market activity involving Third Army soldiers, faced the dilemma of maintaining discipline without demoralizing troops who believed they deserved some tolerance after 8 months of combat. The fraternization policy that prohibited American soldiers from friendly interaction with German civilians proved impossible to enforce and created resentment among troops who saw the policy as pointless. The non-fraternization order, issued by Eisenhower in spring 1945, forbade American soldiers from speaking to German civilians, except in official capacity, entering German homes except on official business, or developing personal relationships with Germans. The policy reflected concern that German civilians might use friendly contact to gather intelligence, or that American soldiers might be manipulated by Germans trying to avoid occupation restrictions. But soldiers who had just defeated Germany saw little threat from German civilians who appeared cooperative and desperate for American approval. Enforcement was inconsistent and increasingly ineffective as months passed. By late summer, the non-fraternization policy was widely ignored, with soldiers dating German women, accepting invitations to German homes, and developing friendships that violated official policy but seemed natural to soldiers who were preparing to return home. July 10th, 1945, Patton's promotion to military governor of Bavaria brought increased responsibilities but also increased scrutiny of his administrative decisions. The promotion reflected Eisenhower's confidence in Patton's capabilities, but also removed him from direct command of military operations that had been his life's focus. As military governor, Patton was responsible for establishing functional government in Bavaria, addressing displaced persons crisis, implementing denazification, maintaining public order, and managing relationships with German civilian authorities. These responsibilities required political sensitivity, diplomatic patience, and bureaucratic skills that Patton lacked and had no interest in developing. He approached civil administration with the same aggressive decisiveness he had brought to combat operations, issuing orders and expecting immediate compliance, showing impatience with subordinates who raised practical objections or explained why simple solutions wouldn't work. The displaced persons camps that Third Army operated became focal points for humanitarian crisis and administrative challenge. Over 300,000 DPs occupied camps in Bavaria alone, living in overcrowded conditions with inadequate sanitation, minimal medical care, and uncertain futures. Jewish survivors, liberated from concentration camps, faced particular challenges. Many couldn't return to home countries where their families had been murdered and their property confiscated. Poland and other Eastern European nations, falling under Soviet influence, were increasingly unwelcoming to Jewish returnees. The camps, intended as temporary facilities pending repatriation, became semi-permanent communities where DPs waited for immigration opportunities to Palestine, America, or other destinations willing to accept them. Third Army administrators, lacking resources and expertise to manage refugee crisis of this scale, did their best to maintain basic humanitarian standards, but struggled with problems that had no military solutions. September 22nd, 1945. The press conference that destroyed Patton's military government career. Reporters invited to ask questions about Bavarian administration, pressed Patton about denazification policy and whether he believed former Nazi party members should be barred from public employment. Patton, responding with characteristic bluntness, stated that the Nazi Party in Germany was similar to Republican or Democratic parties in America and that party membership didn't necessarily indicate criminal behavior. He argued that skilled administrators were needed regardless of past party affiliation and that occupation government needed to be practical rather than punitive. The statements, accurately reported by journalists, created immediate scandal. American veterans organizations protested, Jewish groups demanded Patton's removal, Congress members called for investigation of Third Army's denazification program. Eisenhower, receiving direct orders from Secretary of War Henry Stimson to address the controversy, had no choice but to relieve Patton of his positions. October 7th, 1945. Eisenhower met with Patton in private and delivered news that both men knew was inevitable. Patton would be relieved as Third Army commander and as military governor of Bavaria. He would be reassigned to command 15th Army, a headquarters organization responsible for compiling operational reports and historical studies rather than commanding troops. The assignment was effectively retirement with nominal title, removing Patton from positions where his statements could create diplomatic problems while avoiding the embarrassment of outright dismissal. Patton accepted the decision without protest, understanding that he had violated political norms that Eisenhower couldn't ignore. In his diary that night, Patton wrote that he had been punished for telling truth and that political considerations had become more important than military effectiveness. He was partially correct. His statements about denazification were politically unacceptable regardless of their practical merit, but he was also wrong. Effective military command in peacetime required political sensitivity that he refused to learn. The soldier discipline problems that emerged during occupation reflected broader challenges of transitioning combat army to peacetime garrison force. Soldiers who had fought with courage and followed orders under combat conditions became increasingly undisciplined as occupation duties replaced combat operations. Drunkenness, fighting, black market involvement, and other violations of military law increased monthly through summer and autumn 1945. Military police, overwhelmed by volume of incidents, couldn't effectively enforce discipline. Officers, many of whom sympathized with soldiers who believed they deserved tolerance after their combat service, were inconsistent in punishment. The point system that determined who could return home created further problems. Soldiers with sufficient points awaiting transportation, while soldiers without enough points remained in units that were severely under strength and demoralized. Third Army, which had functioned as precision instrument during combat, was degrading into collection of units, marking time until demobilization. The official deactivation of Third Army on October 10th, 1945, marked the end of an organization that had achieved unprecedented operational success during 8 months of combat. The deactivation was administrative formality. Third Army headquarters became 15th Army headquarters, and units were reassigned to occupation forces under different designations. But the deactivation symbolized transition from war to peace that veterans experienced with mixture of relief and loss. They were proud of what Third Army had accomplished, the territory liberated, the enemies defeated, the contribution to victory. But they also recognized that the organization that had given their combat service meaning was dissolving, that peacetime army would be different from wartime army, and that the bonds formed under combat stress wouldn't survive transition to garrison duty and eventual return to civilian life. Third Army would be reactivated in 1946 as occupation force, but it would never again be the combat organization that Patton had commanded from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. November 9th, 1945, Patton, now commanding 15th Army in a headquarters position he found boring and pointless, wrote in his diary that he missed the purpose and clarity that combat command had provided. He was 59 years old, wealthy, famous, and facing future that offered no challenges worthy of his abilities. He couldn't return to combat command given the controversies surrounding his relief. He couldn't adapt to peacetime armies' bureaucratic requirements and political constraints. He couldn't retire gracefully and accept civilian life after decades of military service. The restlessness and frustration that characterized his final weeks would end on December 9th, when a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, left him paralyzed. He would die 12 days later, never returning to America, buried at Luxembourg American Cemetery among soldiers who had served under his command. The death seemed fitting for a warrior who had lived for combat and struggled with peace. Third Army survived him, continuing as occupation force and later as Cold War organization, but it would never again have the combination of leadership, timing, and circumstances that made it the most effective American combat army of World War II. December 21st, 1945, Heidelberg, Germany. A military hospital room where General George S. Patton lay paralyzed from automobile accident 12 days earlier. Doctors had determined that damage to his spine was irreparable, that he would never walk again, and that complications from the injury would likely prove fatal despite their best efforts. Patton, conscious and lucid, understood his condition and faced it with the same aggressive determination he had brought to combat command. He told visiting officers that he regretted nothing about his military career, that he had fought the war he believed needed to be fought, and that he hoped Third Army's record would speak for itself. On December 21st at 1750 hours, George S. Patton died of pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. He was 59 years old. His death, occurring less than 8 months after Germany's surrender and weeks after his relief from Third Army command, seemed to close a chapter in military history. But Third Army's legacy was just beginning to be understood. December 24th, 1945, Luxembourg American Cemetery. Patton's funeral drew thousands of Third Army soldiers who travelled from occupation duties across Germany to pay respects to the commander who had led them through 8 months of combat. The ceremony was simple by military standards, reflecting wartime austerity and Patton's own preference for direct action over elaborate ritual. Patton was buried among enlisted soldiers who had died during the Bulge campaign, his grave marked with standard military headstone identical to those surrounding it. The burial location was symbolic. Patton had requested burial among his soldiers rather than at West Point or Arlington, choosing to rest with men who had died executing his orders. The soldiers attending the funeral represented cross-section of Third Army's wartime organization: infantry who had assaulted fortified positions, tankers who had driven across Europe, artillerymen who had fired millions of rounds in support, and logistics personnel who had kept the army supplied. They mourned a commander who had been demanding, sometimes cruel, often controversial, but undeniably successful. The statistical record Third Army compiled during 8 months of combat from August 1944 through May 1945 established benchmarks for operational effectiveness that military organizations would study for decades. Third Army advanced over 700 miles from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, averaging nearly 3 miles per day across entire campaign, including static periods. It liberated or captured 81,000 square miles of territory in 6 countries, area larger than Great Britain. Third Army engaged and defeated elements of approximately 90 German divisions during the campaign, capturing 956,000 prisoners and killing or wounding an estimated 500,000 Germans. These achievements came at cost of 137,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, producing casualty ratio of approximately 4 enemy casualties for every American casualty. The ratio was remarkable for offensive operations where conventional military wisdom expected attackers to suffer higher casualties than defenders. The operational innovations Third Army pioneered became foundational elements of American military doctrine that persisted through Cold War and beyond. Combined arms integration at platoon and company level, where tanks and infantry operated as permanent teams rather than separate elements, became standard organization in American armored divisions. Time-on-target artillery techniques that synchronized fire from multiple battalions became standard fire support procedure taught at artillery schools. Air-ground coordination procedures that Third Army developed with 19th Tactical Air Command established frameworks for close air support that remained relevant into jet age. Forward supply systems that pushed logistics to frontline units rather than requiring units to withdraw for resupply became template for sustaining mobile operations. The innovations weren't purely technical but reflected organizational culture that emphasized aggressive execution, decentralized decision-making, and acceptance of risk in exchange for operational tempo. The controversial aspects of Patton's leadership and Third Army's operations received increased scrutiny in years following the war as historians accessed documents and interviewed participants. The supply theft from First Army in September 1944 was documented through quartermaster records that showed Third Army requisitioned supplies without proper authorization. The forced repatriation of Soviet citizens to almost certain imprisonment or death was confirmed through survivor testimony and Soviet archival materials. The occasional executions of SS guards at liberated concentration camps were documented through soldier accounts and investigation reports. The employment of former Nazi Party members in Bavarian government despite denazification directives was confirmed through administrative records. These controversies complicated Patton's legacy, revealing that his effectiveness as combat commander came with methods that violated regulations and ethical principles that peacetime perspective found troubling. The historical debate about whether Patton could have ended the war in 1944 if given fuel priority continued through decades of scholarship with no consensus emerging. Advocates of the narrow front strategy argued that Third Army in late August stood within striking distance of the Rhine with minimal German opposition, that crossing the Rhine before German defences solidified could have shortened the war by months, and that broad front strategy squandered this opportunity through excessive caution. Critics of this counterfactual argued that Third Army lacked logistical depth to sustain operations beyond the Rhine, that German reserves could have counterattacked exposed flanks, and that attempting to reach the Ruhr industrial region in September would have created overextended salient vulnerable to defeat. The debate couldn't be resolved because the alternative history couldn't be tested. What was certain was that Third Army, given maximum feasible support in September, could have advanced further than it did. But whether that advance would have ended the war or led to disaster remained unknowable. The efficiency analysis that military scholars conducted decades after the war revealed that Third Army achieved its results through superior operational tempo rather than overwhelming material advantage. Third Army never received more than 25 to 30% of available supplies during periods when resource allocation was constrained, yet consistently achieved greater results than armies receiving priority support. The explanation was organizational. Third Army's forward supply system, decentralized command structure, and aggressive operational culture enabled it to do more with less than armies that operated more cautiously with greater resources. The efficiency came at costs that statistics didn't fully capture. Higher casualty rates among junior officers who led from front, greater equipment wear from sustained operations, and dependence on commander willing to accept risks that more cautious leaders avoided. But the efficiency demonstrated that organizational effectiveness mattered as much as material resources in determining military outcomes. 1973. Veterans of Third Army, now in their 50s and 60s, gathered for a reunion in Washington, D.C. The reunion attracted thousands of former soldiers who traveled from across America to reconnect with comrades and share memories of wartime service. The conversations revealed how combat experience had shaped lives across intervening decades. Some veterans had built successful civilian careers using leadership skills developed during the war. Others struggled with trauma that decades hadn't healed, nightmares about combat that persisted long after guns fell silent. Many expressed pride in Third Army's achievements while acknowledging costs that peacetime America couldn't fully understand. The reunions, which continued annually for decades, served multiple purposes: maintaining bonds formed under stress, correcting historical record when popular accounts got details wrong, and providing community for men whose defining life experiences occurred during 8 months of combat that grew increasingly distant from contemporary America's understanding. Present day. Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Military officers from American and Allied nations study Third Army's operations as case studies in operational art and campaign planning. The Normandy breakout illustrates exploitation operations. The 90-degree turn to Bastogne demonstrates operational flexibility and responsive logistics. The Saar-Palatinate campaign shows sophisticated use of multiple corps to achieve encirclement. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim teaches the value of surprise and accepting risk. These case studies, analysed through modern staff planning frameworks, reveal that Third Army's successes resulted from specific conditions and capabilities that can't be easily replicated. Patton's personal leadership style, while effective in World War II's operational environment, wouldn't necessarily succeed in contemporary military culture with different expectations about command climate and leader behaviour. The material resources available to Third Army, while constrained compared to what Patton wanted, exceeded what most modern military organisations could access. The operational environment, where enemies could be destroyed and territories occupied, differed fundamentally from contemporary operations focused on stability and counterinsurgency. Present-day interview. Walter Thompson, 99 years old, veteran of 4th Armoured Division, sitting in living room of his home in rural Pennsylvania. Thompson enlisted in 1942 at age 17, joined 4th Armoured in Britain, and fought from Normandy through Czechoslovakia. Asked what made Third Army successful, he pauses, considering decades of reflection compressed into brief answer. "We thought we could do anything, and we did," he finally says. "Patton made us believe there was nothing we couldn't accomplish if we just kept moving forward. Sometimes that belief cost us. Soldiers died because we took risks other units wouldn't take. But more often, it saved us because we moved so fast that Germans couldn't organize defenses. We weren't better soldiers than other armies. We were just more aggressive, and that made all the difference." The assessment from soldier who experienced the war at ground level captures something that strategic analysis sometimes misses: the psychological dimension of operational success, where belief in organizational capability becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. The Third Army legacy ultimately transcends Patton's controversial personality and individual operational decisions to represent something larger about military effectiveness under specific historical conditions. Third Army succeeded because it combined aggressive doctrine with organizational capability to execute that doctrine under pressure. It had a commander whose personal flaws were matched by genuine operational genius. It had soldiers whose training and experience enabled them to fight effectively across 8 months of continuous operations. It had technological advantages, radios, trucks, aircraft, that enabled operational tempo beyond what previous generations could achieve. And it had an enemy who, despite fighting with skill and determination, was strategically defeated before Third Army entered combat, making operational success achievable if executed aggressively. Remove any of these elements, replace Patton with cautious commander, reduce logistical capabilities, face enemy with operational flexibility, and Third Army's record might have been ordinary rather than exceptional. The assessment of Third Army's contribution to Allied victory must balance acknowledgement of genuine achievement against recognition of broader context. Third Army didn't win World War II alone. Soviet forces destroyed the bulk of German military power on the Eastern Front. British and Canadian forces fought critical battles in Normandy and Northwest Europe. American strategic bombing degraded German industrial capacity. Allied naval forces ensured logistics flow that sustained all ground operations. Third Army was one component, albeit highly effective one, in coalition effort that defeated Nazi Germany. But within its sphere of operations, Third Army demonstrated what aggressive mobile warfare could achieve when properly organized and supported. It liberated millions of people from Nazi occupation. It destroyed German forces that could have prolonged the war and increased Allied casualties. It demonstrated operational methods that influenced military doctrine for generations. These contributions justified the resources committed to Third Army and validated Patton's aggressive approach despite controversies that surrounded him. The final assessment appears on Patton's gravestone at Luxembourg American Cemetery, where simple military headstone lists his name, rank, and dates without elaboration. The simplicity reflects Patton's preference and military tradition that treats all soldiers equally in death, regardless of rank in life. Visitors to the cemetery encounter Patton's grave among thousands of enlisted soldiers, visual reminder that command success depends on soldiers who execute operations, and that glory won through their sacrifice belongs to them as much as to commanders who directed them. Third Army's legacy isn't Patton's alone, but belongs to over 500,000 soldiers who served in the organization during